Two guys came to a certain temple. They thought it was empty, but there were people around it. There were quite a few of these people. Liu Jin and Zhou Zuo did not like this, because they thought that the information should not have leaked. One of those present told the first guy that he was late. He was irritated because these people arrived before him. And later he became completely furious, because he thought that his spiritual palace had acquired this information exclusively. Another person who arrived didn't understand why everyone had come here if the owner of this house, Shu Xiaoshu, was only at the third stage. His friend explained that the man had been in the sect for a long time and therefore had some savings and artifacts. They were planning to storm in when the formation ended and they could legally kill him and take the treasure. Liu Chenyu decided to take a position in advance. However, he was not allowed to do this. The guy was stage 5, which was older than their stages, but he couldn't handle them all alone. A quarrel arose between them, but the door of the house suddenly opened. The redhead immediately realized that the owner of the house had come to visit them. He said angrily that they were preventing him from sleeping. For some reason, people thought that he died, and he immediately wilted. That Xiaoshu really did die, because now in his body is the guy who died from a fatal disease in another world. They both had unhappy lives, but now the guy decided to pull himself together. He decided to start his second life anew. However, in this world, he was too weak, unlike the others. But suddenly a roulette wheel appeared in front of him. It had active skills written on it and a small strip with a passive skill. The guy already thought that he was being made fun of. From a gaming perspective, he thought active skills were much more useful. And the roulette was very conscientious, because almost all the space was for active ones. Now he was thinking about how this roulette worked. He started to move the arrow, but it almost broke. The boy again thought that he was being made fun of. But suddenly he realized that since the arrow was not moving, he had to turn the disc. Finally, the system came into action. The needle was dangerously approaching the red mark. The guy was hoping for an active skill. However, somehow the needle fell to the red mark. Out of anger, the guy decided to spin the roulette wheel again. But the system didn't let him do it. He felt very sad about it. As a result, he was given some kind of breathing technique, which he immediately decided to try. After a heavy sigh, his body began to rise into the air, and suddenly he realized that he had broken through to a new stage. Apparently, it was a cultivation technique. He was pleased with the ability he had acquired. The hero was already imagining how he would become invincible, but suddenly he heard a buzzing sound. A mosquito immediately pierced his defense. However, after his bite, the guy received a certain passivity point. They could be used to upgrade a passive ability. Suddenly, he heard sounds outside the house. The action has moved to the present day. Due to suspicions against him, he received 12 points of passivity. Meanwhile, the guy was analyzing the arrivals. He realized that they had come for his sword. However, the hero had no intention of giving them anything, showing that he had broken through to the 4th stage. And given his sword, he would not be inferior to anyone in a fight. The main character began to threaten them. This is why Zhen decided to retreat. Xiaoshu was no one's opponent, so they all began to disperse. But suddenly someone stopped them. It was the protagonist who was unhappy with how easily they came and went. Those present thought that he was going to fight them. But in reality, he just wanted to say something to earn some points. Suddenly, he joyfully said that he had broken through to the 5th stage. Everyone was simply taken aback by this information, which added 17 points of passivity to the hero. In his mind, he thought that because of these glasses, he was already almost at stage 6. And with every action he took, he only gained points. And then came the mockery, which angered people. They looked at him as if he were crazy. The boys took it too seriously. Taking advantage of the noise, the main character decided to retreat into the house. He immediately jumped through the door. Covering her with his body, he held back the crowd from righteous anger. Suddenly, he was awarded 1 point for praise. He didn't understand who it was, and a certain girl began to descend towards his house. The hero looked in the mirror and realized how similar he was to the previous owner of the body. However, he will no longer tolerate such bullying. Suddenly, he had a new ability unlocked, the shopping mall. He could only buy a box of passive skills for 10 points. The guy immediately decided to buy it. From the box, he received 10 skill points and 3 passive keys, which immediately appeared in the store. Individually, these items were worth 1,000 times more. That's why the hero was happy with this newbie starter kit. The system then announced that he needed to use a key to spin the roulette wheel. But he didn't have much hope for roulette, because he didn't even see the possible prizes. However, it would have been a sin not to take advantage of the opportunity. Now he begged fate to give him a passive skill. But instead of a reward, he was only thanked for his visit. However, it was worth trying again. The second time, the result was the same, and the third time, the hero no longer had any hope of success. However, the system pleased him by giving him a passive enhancement skill. The effects of the gift blinded the guy a little. He didn't feel any increase in strength, but judging by the name, the skill should have been excellent. He also thought that the gain was not obvious due to the low level. Using skill points, he increased the skill to level 5. Now the effect has begun to be felt. He didn't stop at the 5th rank and started investing points further. After some time, he went outside. The skill was pumped up to the 8th level, and his body was dramatically transformed. He decided to test his strength, and a moment later, his fist flew into the ground at full speed. The hand easily broke through the masonry, and cracks appeared in the bricks. The new power was amazing. Now his body had reached the 8th stage of spirit tempering, so he decided to invest the remaining points into strengthening. But suddenly he realized that in addition to the acquired enhancement, he now also had an innate one. And later his muscles even twisted, causing the guy to feel severe pain. The body turned sharply red, and the air around began to fill with steam. The guy simply began to swim in ecstasy. This new innate skill gave him such sensations. Then he decided to immediately test the strength of his new body, and do it in the same way as before. However, instead of the broken masonry, a column of dust and stones hit the sky. The fog began to lift, and the silhouette of the hero began to appear in it. After this, the guy exhaled heavily. With this destructive power, he could claim the championship in the Tournament of Chasing Clouds. The Cloud Chasing Tournament is the sect's annual exam where fellow practitioners compete in techniques. The body's old owner was banned for 2 years for losing the tournament, and if he didn't make it through, he would be banned permanently. And so the guy decided to show them the rebirth of the Phoenix. He promised Xiao Shu that he would make his life much better than it was before. The action moved to the spiritual palace of Tiansan. The hero went about his business, and everyone else bowed at his feet. They greeted him, wishing him good morning. But he didn't pay any attention to them. For others, his presence felt completely different than it had before. Some even thought it was a different person. Finally, Shu reached the crowd. This was the cue to participate in the tournament. Suddenly, the guy noticed that there was only one empty window here. He immediately realized what was going on and decided to knock on it. And behind him, Elder Chao slept peacefully. The old man woke up and looked with interest at who had come to wake him up. The elder greeted Shu cheerfully and asked how he had not died yet. The hero realized that no one went through that window precisely because of the old man, because he was rude. Chao thought the boy wanted to drop out, but he sarcastically said that he should be in the top 10 students. The old man understood the joke, and the system gave the hero 1 point for sarcasm. However, the guy explained that he was not joking, and that his body, after the killer meditation, was in the innate realm. The old man spat out water in surprise at this news, and then he laughed heartily. It was clear that Chao did not believe his words. Such a sharp and loud reaction made Shu feel embarrassed, and people around started discussing him. But one of them heard the conversation better than anyone else and said that the hero declared that he had achieved innateness. However, it was hard to believe. The wave of doubts earned him 90 points of passivity. This made the guy happy, but now the old man seriously asked why he had come. The hero explained that he had come to register for the Cloud Chasing Tournament, and thanks to the old man's advice, he decided to participate as a 4th stage disciple so as not to be disgraced. Embarrassed again, he asked Chao not to forget about giving him the spiritual crystals. The old man was a bit hesitant, but still gave him 12 crystals. I also personally bought the elixir for the guy, but asked him not to tell anyone about it. The elder was worried about the main character, which he greatly appreciated and wanted to repay the old man for his kindness. He in turn turned his back to him and said a short goodbye. But in reality, it was just a pretense, because it was he who sold the information about Shu's death meditation, receiving a 10-fold profit. At that moment, the guy got a point for worrying and for lying. In total, he had 148 passivity points. It seems that in order to become stronger, he will have to make his way into the crowd and create chaos, or even play the role of a villain. But he immediately abandoned these ideas. In the opened bottle, he saw 3 spirit-tempering pills, which were much more expensive and stronger than ordinary spirit crystals. However, he didn't know how to use them, and the next second he decided to sniff it. His consciousness immediately began to cloud over, and he found himself in ecstasy again. Cultivation was a truly enjoyable experience, and most importantly, it was very effective, because in one breath he broke through to the 4th level thanks to his breathing technique. These were just ordinary crystals, but now he decided to try what was in the bottle. And with a manic look, he reached out to her. Meanwhile, 3 days passed. Xiao Kixu, or the Great Elder, and also the chief judge of the tournament, stood in the air and thoughtfully looked into the distance. He announced that the total number of people would be divided into 18 groups of 100 each. He also reminded them that no one would save them if they failed the tests due to their weakness. This meant that they could easily die. In this way, he wanted to prepare them for life. Zhao, who was sitting behind him, only chuckled at these pretentious words. But Xiao ignored him and announced the start of the tournament. Now the curators had taken everything into their own hands, and the first test was to hold out until the end. Prizes will be awarded to the top 10, and they will be able to advance to the next stage of the tournament. They started calling the students by number, and the first to appear were Zhou Zuo and Liu Zhen. The first one didn't like that he was in the same group with the red-haired one. Next, Chao Xiaosan and Xu Xiaoshu were called to them. Redhead was already in anticipation. Suddenly, Xiaoshu was called again because he had not shown up. People began to mockingly think where he could disappear to. The examiner repeated for the 3rd time. The head of the sect stated that if the guy does not appear, then the man should move on to the next one. Chao couldn't understand how the guy managed to be late for such an event. Meanwhile, Zhao Yinyan asked why Su Qianqian didn't wake up her favorite, and she immediately became embarrassed. He once helped this girl, and she supported him at tournaments. Her sister suggested that Su find someone else. 2 girls sat and loudly discussed their personal affairs, which greatly irritated the examiner. And so he shouted even louder than before, calling out to Xu Xiaoshu. Time suddenly moved to the night before the tournament. At this moment, he was crushing the crystals with a spoon. And then, like a hardened drug addict, he snorted them through a straw. With a strong breath, he pushed them further into his lungs. And a moment later, he was carried away to distant lands. It all looked extremely strange. And on the day of the tournament, it was extremely difficult for him to get to the sect. He dragged himself bent over into the palace, leaning on his sword. Suddenly, he heard some footsteps behind him. It was an old man who asked if the boy was from the outer courtyard. Starsha thought that he was not going to take part in the tournament, but the hero said that that was exactly where he was going. Then the old man began to encourage him. And the guy moved like a turtle, because due to the rate at which he was absorbing crystals, his body could no longer cope with the load. However, the old man was surprised by the fact that the hero's gait, although unsteady, was still fluid, and his steps were completely silent. A moment later, he was out of sight, and it occurred to him that the outer court was where the real talent was wasted. Meanwhile, at the tournament, Shu was called up for the last time, and yet he made it. Su saw him and told her sister that this was the same guy. But the girl didn't understand what Qianqian did to him, because he looked like he'd been whoring all night. Jia thought it was the work of the little one. She, in turn, became very embarrassed and asked to stop. Meanwhile, the main character apologized to the examiner. Old Man Chow tried to understand what the guy was doing, and the tournament has finally begun. Fights immediately began to break out between the participants. The main character also managed to knock someone down, and some even received sword blows to the body. Shu, meanwhile, was only catching fallen soldiers. He was starting to get annoyed at how these guys were getting killed so easily. He rose in body and spirit, ordering that this be stopped. Everyone turned towards him. The guy thought that all of them should become his passivity points so they can't die. He suggested that they all attack him en masse, but his legs continued to shake, which was visible to absolutely everyone. So people just looked at him with disdain. The taunt worked, and Shu immediately received 60 points of passivity. Now he said that he would give this 9th grade sword to the one who defeats him. The judge will be a witness. At this moment, interest flared in the crowd. They pounced on the guy like wild animals, but that's what the hero wanted. Zhao also noticed that this guy had a spirit of self-sacrifice. Meanwhile, her friend was rooting for the hero. The examiner understood that all this was being done for a reason, and he watched the guy carefully. The fighters had already begun to use their skills towards Shu, but the guy decided that he would fight with his bare hands. With just one palm, he took down 2 fighters, and the examiner began to announce those who had dropped out. The rest of the students began to back away due to the aura emanating from the hero. Now they were all in his trap. Asu screamed victoriously, supporting the boy. The sect leader immediately realized that Shu had innate breathing, and the hero began to boast and say that the students could only try to defeat him with weapons in their hands. Chao didn't recognize the boy's talent and therefore began to worry. Suddenly, a muscular guy came out to the hero, and they began to duel. The guy with sideburns decided to use his technique. It was a skill that combined 100 attacks in one blow. Zhu smiled demonstratively as he was hit in all his vital spots, and the second student tried his best to hurt him. However, the hero stood still. But even 3 applications of this technique did not produce results, and the guy still had no intention of falling. Now the hero turned to Chu Wei. He showed him the middle finger and said that the guy apparently hadn't eaten porridge for a long time. This made the jock extremely angry. At this moment, Chu Wei used the blood-burning technique. She processed blood into power, but the price was too high. Now Chu Wei's technique looked much more impressive. Zhao thought that this blow would turn the hero into a pancake. The haze after the impact began to clear and everyone could only guess how it all ended. But more bets were on Chu Wei to win. However, his face reflected the opposite. The muscle man started to fall to the ground, but Shu managed to catch him with one hand. He arrogantly suggested that Wei take a rest. Everyone was simply taken aback by this turn of events. No one could believe their eyes. And Zhu, in turn, asked who wanted to be next. At this moment, the hero received 300 points because Wei attacked him. He was grateful to the muscle man, but he was in no mood for gratitude. The rest of the students were trying to figure out what to do with Shu. After emerging from meditation, the hero began to behave very strangely. No one thought that he had reached a stage less than the 5th. Shu explained that he had achieved innate level enhancement. I didn't want to believe it, but my eyes told me otherwise. However, one of the students thought that Shu was just bragging, trying to hide the fact that he was exhausted. Having planned everything carefully, he was confident of his victory. He stepped forward, introduced himself as Ye Chongting, who wielded the offering fist and asked for advice. Shu only looked down in disdain, as this technique was only aimed at killing. So the hero suggested that he change his technique, but Ye Chongting thought that the guy was scared. This became a sign that the student should take action. He immediately pounced on the hero. He was surprised by the abrupt reception, but still did not make a mistake. And Chunting flew to the side. Zhu simply took a half step to the side. He won this duel, and Chongting began to complain about the injustice. The hero apologized to him, since he was more interested in the 100-hit technique. He then called on the disciples to attack in a crowd. His provocation worked. People were going to simply push the guy out of the arena. And finally, the cry for action was heard. And the hero was waiting for this moment. 100 blows rushed towards Shu, and he just stood there and accepted them, getting points for it. The examiner was simply taken aback by such events, and only Elder Xiao looked at this with interest. He noticed Shu's talent, realizing that he already had 3 innate skills. Su also reacted in her own way, starting to get angry at the crowd that attacked one guy, and the other girls started crying. They felt sorry for Shu, but they admired his resilience. And all the girls immediately started supporting him. Now he started getting points for inspiration too. However, Xiao asked to end this farce. The examiner announced that there were 15 minutes left until the end of the exam. Shu was unhappy with the tournament's time limit, but he still decided to finish this performance. The hail of blows did not subside. However, this time Shu decided to fish out one of the hands. He grabbed the student's forearm tightly, and then he threw him out of the arena. This started happening to others too. And soon every fighter was sent to fly. Like a flock of birds, they dived into the ditch near the arena. And soon there was not a single student left standing in the center except Shu. That's what it seemed like at first. But one of them survived. It was that guy with the 100-punch reception. He wanted to escape from there, but Shu didn't want to let him do it. The hero offered him one more round before time ran out. He liked how the student became after the blood was burned, and so he would like to have another round. However, the student decided to choose a different destiny. He jumped out of the arena and the examiner had to stop the tournament. Their competition was over. Meanwhile, the red-haired man and his brother, it turns out, were also able to hold their ground in the arena. And they made it into the top 3. What was still surprising to the audience was that Shu Xiaoshou won. Many began to admire his strength, giving him more than 1,000 passive points. Red congratulated Shu, who responded in kind. The examiner did not like how the tournament ended, but he was obliged to give the hero a reward for first place. It was the champion's spatial ring, a rare treasure worth 1,000 gold. It was far more valuable than his 9th-rank sword. And having mentioned the sword, the judge explained that it was already in the ring. Zhao, meanwhile, stretched and said that her sister could go to her little brother. But she was also happy with the fact that the guy wouldn't be expelled, so she didn't want to go. The redhead continued to egg the little one on. She said that if Su didn't mind, she would ask Shu to become her Taoist partner. It was a joke, but the little one got angry and ran away from her. Zhao found this very cute. Su noticed the girls. He recognized Su because he once helped her, and Zhao stood nearby. She looked at the guy and smiled eloquently. Yu suddenly received a passivity point for seduction. He was angry at the system for so brazenly ruining all the surprise, but his face showed the opposite. The guy had already started dreaming about depraved things with Zhao, and his face turned red. But Qiao interrupted his fantasies and congratulated the guy on his victory. The old man didn't like that he hadn't been noticed, because the hero had been staring at the girl the whole time. The guy immediately began to make excuses. Qiao asked why he hid his skills from the old man, but Shu immediately stated that he told him everything last time. The old man immediately realized his mistake, because he himself did not believe the guy. Grandfather began to make excuses, but Shu made an offended face. In response, he decided to appease the guy with an elixir. The hero began to understand what they were offering him, and like a drug addict, he tried to snatch the bottle from the old man's hands. A little later, he was already at home. Having washed himself, he wandered towards the bed, and when he lay down, the pendant on his belt jingled. He was pleased with his latest successes. Suddenly, he remembered that he needed to put some blood on the new ring. The space was half the size of the house, and inside lay an elixir and 100 crystals. He decided to quickly put the tempering elixir into the ring. It was his first victory on a path of life full of suffering. Now he decided to see how many points he had earned. Having called the system, he looked closely at the number, and when he started counting, he realized that there were 5 digits. At the moment, he had almost 18,000 points. This made the guy extremely happy, but before that, it was worth looking at what he could spend them on. Something new appeared in his system. However, he could not understand when it appeared there. He could unlock the purchase of second-tier skills for 5,000 points. This was necessary to start pumping up the power-up. However, instead, he decided to spend the points to unlock more skills. He spent 10,000 points on keys at once. The current number made Shu feel upset, but the presence of 10 chances for something new warmed my soul. He immediately called for roulette. However, he was not pleased with the result. Already, half of his attempts have given him nothing. But the guy wasn't going to give up. On the penultimate key, he got a new skill. It was called a spearhead, but that didn't describe it at all. And the guy thought that since this was a long-term passive skill, his nails would probably get sharper. He tried to pierce the table with force, but he only experienced pain, and the result obtained was rather due to strengthening. The guy began to wonder why his skill wasn't doing anything, but suddenly it dawned on him. The skill was level 1, and judging by the fact that even the first rank boost was useless, the new skill was worth leveling up. And now Shu was thinking whether to spend points on new skills or improve the current one. He had one more key left, so he decided not to push his luck. He pointed at his inventory, but the screen began to dim. What he saw made the guy scared. There was a legend that there was a powerful sword technique that was created by Elder Cha, the last owner of the Holy Spirit Temple. Future generations adopted this technology and created new ones based on it, but its quality decreased tenfold. The new technique was divided into 13 swords, but Shu had only learned the first sword, the calm white cloud. As his mind was consumed by darkness, he saw the hidden bitterness flying away with him to the clouds. The first sword had no beginning and no end, and countless insights into swordsmanship immediately poured into the hero's mind. And after some time, he came to his senses. The aura emanating from him immediately tore his clothes. The last key he mastered was the passive mastery skill, which was the sword skill. And at the same time, he had 2 more skills that could enhance his fencing. So he immediately decided to try out new powers. Only for a moment did he leave the ground. And then he struck one weak blow. But everything that was in front of him turned to crumbs. The guy opened his eyes, and huge chips and pieces of wood flew over his head. He immediately became frightened, because a roof tile flew at him. With his blow, he immediately buried himself under a tree and a rock. Meanwhile, the elders were having lunch in the pavilion. She said that he doesn't like alcohol, and Qiao, in response to this, was unable to hold the liquid in his mouth. He sprayed another elder, but later apologized. He then asked if it was true that Xiao had succeeded in kendo only because he did not drink alcohol. He said that he had indeed achieved some success. Xiao changed the subject and asked how long Elder San would be staying with them. He took a sip, and then he said that he would stay for a short time. He also told Xiao that being drunk from the sword and from alcohol were two different things, but it did not affect his skills, because in that case he would be able to comprehend the 8th immortal sword. The two elders laughed at the mockery, but Xiao was not going to tolerate humiliation. However, something made them all perk up. Something unknown was also happening in the outer courtyard. The guard stood at his post, and his sword began to shake convulsively, as were the swords of other people who passed nearby. It was some kind of incomprehensible earthquake, but San recognized it as the cry of swords, which foreshadowed that someone had acquired the acquired sword intent. She said that they have very talented students this year. San also asked about Su, saying that she also showed sword intent last time. Xiao explained that she had manifested an innate intent and was a true genius. Xiao, in turn, had no intention of sitting and chatting here, and wanted to quickly go to the one who had caused the swords to start screaming. The head was also interested, and San asked them to go together. He decided to stay. A minute later, the old man decided to take a sip of alcohol. He poured half the jug into himself. Later, he put on an old Panama hat, and he took his cane. This man was the same old man that Shu had bumped into on his way to the tournament. Meanwhile, the guy finally got out from under the rubble. He realized that he had mastered the first fencing style, but it was much more powerful than the original. Later, the hero decided to dress up because his clothes were torn, and judging by his feelings, he only has a little bit left until the 7th stage. Apparently, he managed to break through during the Enlightenment. Suddenly, he saw two elders in front of him. He didn't understand what they were doing here. Xiao recognized this guy. He was the masochist from the group stage. Shu greeted them and asked what they were doing in his yard. Suddenly, Xiao asked what happened to his house. The guy explained that he was fencing and that it happened due to carelessness. In response, he only received 2 points for being suspicious of him, which made him angry. Xiao, meanwhile, did not understand what this talent had forgotten in the outer courtyard. Xiao walked up to the guy and slapped him on the back of the head, asking why the guy was lying. He didn't believe that the hero was able to comprehend the sword's intention. But the guy just said that it was his yard, and no one could have done to his house what happened. However, the old man was still full of distrust. He thought that some enemies might have attacked the boy's house. The hero was simply taken aback by his wild imagination. The old man offered him his help if the boy would tell who attacked him. However, Xiao joined the performance. Instead of words, the hero only pointed his finger to the side. The old men placed their palms on his shoulders and urged him not to be upset. The hero was extremely upset that no one believed him. He felt a certain helplessness, and by nightfall he was already at the hotel. He was glad that he didn't have to go anywhere, because after the tournament they gave him time to rest. The guy was thinking about what he should upgrade first. Without thinking twice, he put all his points into the tip, and then he looked at his hand. She immediately flew into the floor at full speed. He didn't feel any pain at all, but in the meantime, a hole appeared in the floor. A crowd gathered on the stage of emerging clouds. Xiao was hanging in the air. He congratulated the 180 warriors who had passed the group stage. The next test was divided into 18 stages, and the champions of the previous stages will act as leaders. Everyone watched the old man, spellbound. He went on to explain that there would be 64 winning places in the competition, which could be achieved by winning 3 times in a row. Now the competition has begun. The crowd cheered and rooted for their favorites. The red-haired man's brother was extremely doubtful of his own strength, since there were people around him who were at least at the 7th stage, while he only had the 3rd. He shared this with Liu, but he said that he was also afraid because his cultivation stage was not the highest. Shu, meanwhile, was basking in glory. He heated up the crowd, thereby gaining passivity points. Some people thought he had gone completely crazy. He had warmed up the crowd and was now receiving about 1,000 points at a time for ridicule. His points have already surpassed 4 figures, and this is just with the wave of his hand. The examiner simply stood and watched this spectacle. He couldn't understand what Shu was doing. After some time, this began to greatly irritate the man. He called the guy over to him, and the hero pretended not to realize that the competition had already begun. He said he needed to do some breathing exercises, which made the examiner even more angry. Not paying attention to the man, the boy suddenly ran. The examiner's patience was rapidly running out. But the hero decided not to let things get to the point of anything serious. He was sorry that he wouldn't be able to get points now, because to do that he needed to sense the emotions of the people nearby. But there would be a barrier at the competition. He could have gotten a lot of points. Suddenly he received 1 point for the curse in his direction, after which he immediately began to glance sideways at the examiner. Meanwhile, they were selecting an opponent for the guy. The man announced that D. Sinner would fight against Shu. The girl began to climb the stairs. She greeted the hero, and the guy thought that she was going to give up, which would have a bad effect on her points. So he started goading her, saying that if she gave in, she would be branded. The girl thanked him for the instruction, and the guy smiled warmly at her. Finally, the examiner announced the beginning of the duel. The girl immediately attacked the guy, but he asked her to stop. He wanted to have a fist fight, but she said she knew he owned a sword called Hidden Bitterness. Besides, she recently created a new technique and would like to try it out in battle. The guy was simply taken aback by the fact that he threw away his sword, and the woman decided to attack him. This clearly showed that girls were not to be trusted. He tried to avoid his attacks. However, he didn't plan to attack either, because it would hurt her a lot. However, there was nothing to be done. He raised his fist, and the girl tried to defend herself with the flat side of the sword. The guy made a feint to perform a sweep. The girl's feet couldn't stay on the ground, and she immediately flew down. But she managed to put her hand out to land softly on it. The guy warned her again, and some viewers began to openly criticize the hero for the way he treated the girl rudely. Others didn't understand why Shu was being portrayed as a villain. The guy meanwhile said that since he was physically stronger, he would only use one hand. He still wanted to fight her hand to hand, but she again attacked him with a blade. The fury of battle overwhelmed her, and she ordered him to shut up. However, the guy easily dodged her attacks and asked her to think again about hand-to-hand combat. The girl, in turn, thought that she had previously rooted for Shu, but now he had shown a different side of himself. He continued to dodge her attacks. Suddenly, she asked him to be careful, and then the girl used the skill. The guy had to pick up a wooden sword. A moment later, he soared into the sky. The audience was taken aback by such skills. Meanwhile, the guy took a few steps closer to the girl. He jumped and raised his wooden sword in the air above Dee's head, and the girl's fans immediately started screaming. The guy planned to force the girl into a fist fight. He also explained that her technique is not bad, but it contains only one layer. He said that she should work on her fencing technique, specifically focusing on what she was most confident in. And the girl seriously thought about it. The guy continued to hold the sword at her head. The picture turned out to be somewhat disconcerting, and so the girl hastened to make a dash back. Now she was much more in the mood for battle. Shu got a point for his gratitude and realized that this girl was too simple-minded because she thought she was being taught. She wanted revenge, and a moment later she activated the second skill. Shu thought that her movements would help him in learning the next sword, and a second later they began to dance. The girl's blow failed to reach the guy, and he pressed the sword to her face again. Meanwhile, Dee's fans declared a bloody war on him, and Shu's fans forbade him to be so gentle with her. It was something like flirting, and so the girl became embarrassed again. However, the guy didn't think about it, and therefore didn't understand what was happening to her. A moment later, he gave her another instruction. The girl's consciousness was suddenly struck by an epiphany, and the guy got another point for gratitude. Dee, in turn, moved away from him and decided to attack again. But this time, the guy simply didn't let her do it, knocking the sword out of her hands. Now she was disarmed, and tears began to well up in her eyes. The guy decided to put an end to this farce so that she wouldn't accidentally fall in love with him. He brought the sword to her cheek and told her that she had lost. The girl looked at him strangely. She smiled again and thanked him for his instructions. The hero realized that she was hopeless. Their competition was finally over. Xiao watched their fight and was pleasantly surprised by the guy's skills. Then other students started fighting. Some have already managed to win 3 victories in a row. Shu didn't understand how those students managed to fight so quickly. And while he had a free minute, he decided to stir up the crowd again. He noticed that Sue and her friend were somehow nowhere to be seen. But he noticed his fans who asked him to spank them with that wooden sword. He just happily waved his hand at them after receiving the glasses. Some points were for a declaration of love, which greatly embarrassed the guy. The boy thought that it was all about the wooden sword, so he asked them if they wanted him to give it to them. The girls screamed with delight. This stunned the guy for a few seconds, and he thought they were crazy. He was interrupted from his presentation by the examiner, who said that it was time for him to go into battle. This time, Shu had to fight against Liu Jin. Zhou, in turn, has already lost 2 matches. He encouraged his brother. Closer to the beginning of the duel, Shu was able to get a good look at his enemy and, strangely enough, recognize him. Red was a member of the Quan family, meaning he was a master of fistfighting, which the hero liked. However, his opponent remained silent, which began to irritate Shu. He thought that the redhead, like that girl, was going to give up, and so he began to read out a tirade. But Liu immediately cut him off, saying he wasn't going to give up. This is what Shu wanted to hear. Meanwhile, the redhead was thinking that the hero was just pretending and hiding his strength, and he, in turn, began to receive points for suspicion. He didn't think it was Liu, so he thought there was someone else in the middle of the barrier. The examiner, in turn, was already tired of the guy's antics. Shu grabbed his leg, and the man tried to break away from him. His nerves gave out, and he ordered the guy to return to the center of the arena. However, Zhen still thought that Shu was faking it. They began to engage in fistfights, prompting Liu to take off his weights. They were so massive that when they fell on the floor, they broke it. And his body began to rapidly evolve, reaching the 10th stage of spiritual tempering. The examiner and Shu were simply taken aback by this turn of events. Redhead said that he would not hold back, but the hero couldn't understand what he was talking about. But suddenly a grin appeared on his face. Hanging on the man's leg, he waited for Liu to strike, but he immediately had to dodge. Having come unstuck from the leg, he began to take blows. The audience waited for the appearance of the masochist Shu, who takes all the blows on himself. However, these blows were capable of damaging the hero's body. Each of them also added 2 points, meaning the hits were double. At this rate, Shu was in danger of being thrown out of the arena. He couldn't even draw his sword because of the incessant blows. So he asked Liu to give him a chance, but the red-haired man did not let up his pressure. However, the hero did not give up trying to reason with his enemy, and Shu's body flew further and further away, so he decided to use the tip. He hoped not to kill the redhead on the spot. Suddenly, Liu had to block the blow. He also couldn't understand how the hero could stop his series of blows if he didn't know how to fight in fists. Liu's Great Dark Tribulation fist didn't leave any blood, meaning the blood on Shu's palm wasn't his. Red froze because he couldn't understand what kind of technique it was. The hero explained that it was a technique called spearhead, but Liu didn't believe him. The crowd also could not understand how this was possible. Some thought that Shu had broken his fingers. Liu Jin's technique was at an innate level, and therefore everything became much more ambiguous. Shu took the fight seriously, because the dark energy that accumulated after the blows could come back to haunt him at the most opportune moment, instantly killing the guy. Based on this, the guy suggested fighting with wooden swords. The audience started laughing at how quickly Shu changed his mind, and for some reason the hero's fans screamed with admiration. However, Liu didn't spend much time talking and attacked the guy again. It was unexpected, but the next moment Shu snapped his fingers, and a sword appeared in his hands. Zhen's lunge was immediately interrupted. He realized that things were bad. Meanwhile, Shu stood in place and looked somewhere with a stupid gaze. The spectators realized that their duel was beginning to become truly brutal. After all, if Shu does not reflect the next blow, he will die. The examiner planned to intervene, and Liu had already practically hit the guy. But a stream of blood, which Shu had spewed out of his mouth, hit his face. The guy had to close his eyes, and he struck blindly. But after that, he had to wipe the blood from his face. And when he did, he realized that Shu had completely grabbed him from behind. Their bodies were actually in the air. The audience already thought that Shu was going to die along with him. A second later, there was an explosion and dust rose into the sky. She began to settle, and a silhouette began to appear in the middle of the arena. It was Shu, who looked a little tired, but he sat on the defeated Liu, which meant his victory. The audience began to applaud, and the examiner hurried to approach the boys. He asked if Shu needed a break. He agreed, and the man said that Liu would probably need a break too. And the red-haired man was quickly thrown onto a stretcher. Sometime later, the man approached the boy and asked if he had recovered. But Shu realized that this was just a mockery. Meanwhile, the hero had already accumulated 7,000 points. He was seriously wounded and faced another test. However, the elder had given him a 10th grade pill the day before, which was supposed to help him. The guy breathed in her scent and instantly perked up. His body began to move, which did not go unnoticed. And a moment later, Shu fell to the floor. He began to shake violently, and the spectators were completely taken aback. But even though the guy was lying down, his condition began to improve. The examiner already wanted to call the healers. However, Shu, in ecstasy, asked to move away from him. The man backed away and decided to do nothing. Shu's reaction made the crowd think he had taken an aphrodisiac right there in the arena. People were still interested in the hero's condition, but he was in relative order, and so they decided to leave him alone. However, the examiner did not help the healer believe that the boy was recovering, but he explained that he didn't know why Shu had such a reaction to the pill. The man realized that he would not find out anything more. After some time, Shu finally came to his senses. He was able to recover, but his body still hurt, and his points increased by 3,000. The examiner approached him and asked if the guy was ready for the third test. Shu asked for a little more time to recover his breathing, but the man said that they had little time, and so they would start right away. The guy realized that he would not be given time to recover. After some time, they began to announce the participants, and Shu's next opponent was Wen Chong. The audience was outraged by this turn of events because Shu had only just come to his senses, and he was already faced with fighting the elder. Wen Chong took second place in the last test. The thing was that he was in 7th place in terms of power in the entire temple. Besides, he was Shu's natural enemy. After all, Liu Jin was this Wen's younger brother. This meant that the hero would be fought with genuine fury. Moreover, Shu had previously slashed Dai's face with a wooden sword, and it is precisely with her that Wen Chong is in love. This only meant that Shu Xiaoshu was in deep trouble. Sometime later, Boss Wen finally entered the arena. A Shu addressed him as a younger brother and greeted him. This did not go unnoticed. The audience was simply taken aback by such impudence, and Wen thought that the hero had simply gone crazy to allow himself to do such a thing. Meanwhile, the examiner announced the start of the competition. Chun had a cloning technique that accumulated over time, so he decided to pull it out. The spectators watched their fight with interest. Shu closed his eyes in the meantime, and Liu immediately understood what was about to happen. Apparently, the hero decided to immediately demonstrate the skill that was shown at the end of the battle with the redhead. In fact, the main character understood what situation he was in, and therefore decided to end everything in one move. Meanwhile, clones began to appear behind Wen. The examiner believed that their duel would only end after someone died, but he also thought that it was definitely not Wen who would die here. At that moment, time stood still around them. Meanwhile, the daggers in Wen's hands began to tremble. The blonde felt something unusual and decided to attack immediately. His clones immediately went on the offensive, but Shu remained calm. No one could understand why he closed his eyes in the face of impending death, and the examiner had already tried to save the guy. But Shu's wooden sword began to shake convulsively. Everyone suddenly realized that it was the intent of the hero's sword, not Wen's daggers. The swords of the other students also began to shake, and the examiner could not understand how he could be so blind. This was Shu's true strength, which he immediately turned against Wen's clones. His blade went into a whole series of unstoppable blows, and the blonde's clones began to rapidly disappear. Zhu's opponent simply could not understand how he could possess such destructive power. Jen, meanwhile, realized that if he hadn't stopped the guy's attack at the end of the fight, he would have been chopped into mincemeat. Meanwhile, Shu's blade was aimed at the real Wen, but suddenly a barrier appeared in front of him. However, Shu only needed to exert himself a little, and the barrier was broken through, and a wooden stick was placed at the blonde's throat. The hero offered him to surrender. Meanwhile, there was not a single living spot on Wen's face. This was the end of their fight. Shu's legs were shaking, but he had to stand up straight. At this moment, Wen began to be overcome by uncontrollable rage. None of the spectators expected the blonde to lose so easily, and he, in turn, was afraid of undermining his authority. The thoughts disappeared from his head, and his hand with the dagger rose sharply. Rage did everything for him. But our cross-eyed hero suddenly received a notification that he had received a point for a sneak attack. That's why he managed to turn around, and the dagger couldn't kill the guy with one blow. Zhu even managed to counterattack, piercing Wen's body with his hand. He was afraid of his own actions, and the examiner couldn't understand what to do. As are the spectators. Xiao was of the same opinion. Wen was shocked that he was able to be pierced with just one palm. A Shu immediately called for help. He tried to save Wen by giving him the Qijin pill, but it immediately fell out of his mouth. After all, the blonde died on the spot. Shu was simply taken aback by such news. The boy couldn't believe that the life of a master of spiritual tempering was so fragile. The examiner tried to calm the black-haired man down, and he went to rest. The spectators could not believe their eyes, because this was the first murder in the outer courtyard in the last 10 years. Some people thought that Shu should be expelled, while others thought otherwise. To these ambiguous cries, the hero left the arena. After some time, evening came. The balcony of Zuya's hotel overlooked the Goose Lake, and he stood and looked at him thoughtfully. Suddenly, he threw a pebble into the lake. His head was filled with thoughts about what had happened. He could not even imagine that human life could be so fragile. And yet he did not regret what he had done, because he came into this world and realized that murder was a common thing in it. The guy unknowingly broke through to the 7th stage of tempering the spirit, and throwing stones into the lake calmed his mind. He was even a little glad that he had crossed that line with murder. As a result, Shu Xiaoshuo stayed at the Goose Lake for the whole night, and so the next morning arrived, and Shu didn't even close his eyes. Suddenly San approached him. He asked the guy if he wanted to watch the tournament, and the hero suddenly realized something. Elder San was the same old man from the mountain. He couldn't believe his eyes. The old man immediately dismissed the boy's suspicions that he had come to talk about Van. San wanted to talk about Shu himself. The elders had already told him about other geniuses, but he liked the boy the most. But the old man's speech seemed like nonsense to Shu, because the people mentioned were the main characters. San, however, said with knowledge of the matter that he already understood that the guy came here to admire the geese. From this moment on, the hero completely lost the essence of the dialogue. Suddenly, Sun said that he had been watching the boy all night and was surprised by how resilient Shu was under the onslaught of mosquitoes. This news finally finished the guy off. Finally, the hero realized what that chill on his neck was. By this time, the old man had finished speaking and asked Shu to say something. But he said that San had literally just asked him to shut up. However, the hero decided to say absolutely everything as it was, and add that it was time for him to go to the tournament. Suddenly, San stopped him. The guy looked at her and asked her to let go of his hand. The window of suspicion did not appear before Shu's eyes, which meant the old man believed him. Suddenly, San reached somewhere into his bosom. He believed the boy and therefore offered him some seed. The situation continued to become more and more strange. The old man forcefully explained that if the guy had a natural body, then everything would be fine with him. As a result, the hero accepted the gift, and San, still smiling, offered him to eat it. Shu hoped it wasn't poison or an aphrodisiac. Now he asked what would happen next, but the old man did not answer. And then he disappeared from sight altogether. It looked like Zuya was about to be covered, and something strange really did start to happen to the guy's body. The news of the murder that had been committed spread throughout the outer courtyard overnight. There were more spectators this time because they missed a lot yesterday. Xiao, meanwhile, began to speak to the crowd. He said that they must already know what happened yesterday. The man did not name any specific names, but simply wanted to remind people of something. He stated that Tiansan Spiritual Palace provided all students with comfortable conditions for cultivation and never wished for anyone to die. However, everyone should know their limits and adhere to morality. Xiao wasn't so talkative before, but now everything has changed, because he is no longer a killer of tens of thousands of people, but a great elder. After this, he announced the decisive fight of the 64 semi-finalists. The tournament has now officially resumed, but Shu suddenly came out into the arena and asked to stop. The audience was extremely unhappy that the guy dared to interrupt the chapter. Meanwhile, something was happening in the judges' seats. That same examiner attracted the attention of his colleagues by starting to discuss Shu. They were curious to see if the boy could surpass Su Qianqian in genius. And the most terrible thing about the hero, in their opinion, was his unpredictability. Xiao rudely told the guy that if he interrupted him over a trifle, the man would deal with him himself here and now. Shu asked for help and began to undress. His body began to burn because of that seed, and he was forced to go into the arena by the fact that all the best healers were located right here. The guy suddenly asked to be removed from the competition because he had taken drugs. He needed a medical examination, but Xiao was extremely angry because the rules did not say that no one could use doping. However, Shu stood his ground. The man cooled his head and tried to understand what was going on. He asked the guy to come over, and a moment later, he placed his hand on his chest. Xiao's hand was immediately left with a burn. Spectators simply could not understand what kind of drug it was that could harm the head of the pavilion, and the old man tried to understand what it was. He learned that it was the seed of the incinerating fireflies, which destroys the innate body. This was said out loud, and therefore Shu was extremely surprised. And the old man suddenly said that this was a useful thing that would not harm the guy. However, this was stupid, because before that he said that the innate body was burning right now. Yu said that he heard everything, but the leader stood his ground. He said that the guy should go and rest, but the hero thought that he still needed medical staff. The boy resigned himself to his fate, but could not understand why he was being treated so unfairly. Xiao became an accomplice to the crime that Sun committed. However, Shu decided to take fate into his own hands and try to cultivate this seed. He took the pill and began to inhale it. He should have done it faster, because he would soon have to participate in the tournament again. Suddenly, an idea came to him. He thought he could get rid of the feeling of anxiety in the heat of battle. Meanwhile, fights were in full swing in the arena. Shu noticed that one of the students had created ice, and the hero was just called to fight him. And the audience finally waited for the release of the masochist Shu. In fact, the guy decided to go to Xiao. He asked the elder for medical help on the condition that he defeat this guy. The judges didn't like Shu's disrespect for the boss. They thought the boy was bothering the old man. Xiao ordered him to return to his place, but the hero stood his ground. But the elder understood that no medical staff could save him, and Shu would have to cope with this on his own. However, the guy decided to get injured so that he would be obliged to heal him. According to the rules, Shu will have to be restored to the best possible condition. Now the hero went to look for his rival Zhang Fu. He yelled, calling the guy to come into the arena, and Zhang Fu sat and listened to his teacher, who was suggesting that the fighter surrender. He did not agree with him. However, the man stood his ground because this time Shu was doped up. Zhang Fu didn't want to give up so easily, so he decided to go. Yesterday, he defeated another genius and believed in himself. This was a very stupid idea. However, Shu did not look strong compared to Zhang Fu. The redhead bowed to the elder and said that he was studying the golden body. Shu was simply taken aback by such news, because the guy was already huge, and he was also studying body strengthening techniques. The competition has finally begun. Shu decided to start provoking the enemy, and Zhang applied his technique. But in the end, they just stood still. The audience simply started laughing, looking at them. Both guys were on defense, but they were only given 15 minutes for the competition, so time was not on their side. Shu's plan was falling apart and he couldn't attack because he was afraid of killing his opponent. Suddenly, the guy asked Xiao for help, but he only chuckled. The hero explained that if he attacked, Zhang could die. Red didn't want to get involved in their quarrels, and the old man challenged Shu, saying that if he killed Zhang, he would win. The student was losing his fighting spirit more and more. The judges were worried about Zhang's health, as he had been caught in the crossfire. Suddenly, the hero decided to take action. His hand immediately began to emit an aura, and the fist rushed towards the enemy. However, he deliberately missed, making a deep hole in the asphalt. Then he even declared that he had taken drugs and no one could compare to him. She said that this is not enough, and Zhang felt the breath of imminent death. The spectators simply couldn't believe their eyes, and the student tried to lower the temperature so that Shu would not injure him. Those watching this only laughed nervously. The hero believed that Xiao was to blame for everything because he didn't want to treat him. Now he attacked Zhang, declaring that the red-haired man was living his last moments. The old man understood that this was not serious, but he still began to get nervous. The hero attacked the enemy, and then he smiled sincerely. Zhang was able to withstand his 5-point blow. This meant that Shu could not hold back. He took a deep breath, and his fist was enveloped in an aura. For Zhang, this fight was probably the last in his life. Shu became serious, but just before the blow, Zhang decided to give up. Shu's fist was dangerously close, and the guy didn't have time to stop him. Zhang's clothes were suddenly gone, and his body looked badly battered. And then it completely caught fire. Xiao immediately ordered him to be healed, and the doctors immediately began treatment. The hero, although he did not receive treatment, felt that he was getting better, and Xiao said that he stopped his hand, otherwise Zhang would have died. The audience heard this, and fear was written on their faces. Shu really amazed everyone with his strength. However, it might not have been his strength, but the drug. Meanwhile, the hero had already left the arena, and the number of his points exceeded 42,000. This news caused him to accidentally hit his head against the wall. The guy couldn't understand where they came from, but suddenly he noticed that he was given 1 point for attack every second. The seed of incinerating fireflies attacked his body every second. Yu sat down and began to count how many points he had received in 3 hours. But the bench collapsed under him, and people passing by asked what happened to him. Zhu asked them for help in counting how many seconds there are in a day. After a couple of seconds, the man said that there are 86,400 seconds in a day. The hero was simply taken aback by such a number. The judge, meanwhile, looked at him as if he were crazy, and Shu continued to sniff the Chijin pills, which were already starting to run out. He came to terms with the pain, because without it one cannot become the strongest. And when the judge started to leave, the guy asked him to ask the man to ask Xiao for some pills. The judge was surprised that the guy was now thinking about pills. The hero decided to instruct the man, saying that he had already asked the medical staff for pills, but he didn't understand how he could say something like that to the head of the pavilion. In case of disagreement, the guy suggested that the man threatened to extort pills from the old man. However, he rudely refused, saying that the hero should go for them himself. However, Shu didn't care much and pressed again. Usagi has already decided to change jobs. A little later, the main character sat and pumped up his abilities. In just 3 days, he accumulated 40,000 points, and he decided to immediately improve the tip to its innate level. When he tested his abilities, he merely waved his hand, and a cut already appeared on the asphalt. Then he poured energy into his leg, and the front part of his boot immediately came off. Every skill that has been leveled up to innate changes greatly. Now any part of the guy's body can become a blade. The guy immediately had an idea about the hair. He threw a magic stone, and a moment later he cut it with his hair. It was really scary. Depending on how you use a passive skill, it can become active. He decided to spend the next 10,000 points on keys. And if he's unlucky, he'll spend more. Finally, he started the roulette wheel. But all 10 attempts were failures. He was extremely upset about this. Usagi managed to notice this performance and became worried that the guy had fallen off his feet. He ran up to the hero and tried to bring him to his senses. But he was upset and asked to be left alone. Sitting in the lotus position, he began to sigh heavily. That was 10,000 wasted points. However, he immediately decided to spend the same amount again. The guy didn't want to be left with nothing. On the 7th try, he finally got the life cycle skill. Now he was happily dancing around the column, and the man looked at him as if he was crazy. Usagi didn't even think that a person could be so happy alone. While Shu was dancing, the column had become considerably worn down, and the life cycle suddenly turned out to be one of the basic passive skills, as well as breathing techniques. They are not as functional, but for an auxiliary purpose, their usefulness is hard to overestimate. The seed of the incinerating fireflies contains energy the size of a fingernail, but the energy itself is so terrifying that it cannot even be quantified. Blood and flesh were burned to a charred state, and the meridians were caked. Thanks to the breathing technique, he was able to recover through pills, but now they have run out too. But now his whole body was recovering on its own. The new skill was something like regeneration, and so he decided to spend the remaining 20,000 points on skill points. All of them were immediately spent on the life cycle, and the body immediately began to frantically recover. In less than a minute, he was free of his wounds. Surprised by this result, he decided to spend another 5 points on the same skill. The life cycle immediately became innate. Now the power of destruction has synchronized with restoration. The skill was truly terrifyingly strong, as he had previously spent 2 whole pills to restore it. A little later, he managed to get dressed and take his sword. The guy decided to test how strong his regeneration was and immediately slashed his hand with a sword. The guy standing next to him was simply taken aback by this, and the blood on the hero's palm began to draw back. And after a couple of seconds, the wound was gone. Suddenly, he saw a mustachioed man. He was surprised that they actually gave him the bottles, and for free, too. But Shu was not surprised by this. The mustachioed man bowed to him reservedly. The guy asked him what it was like to speak so brazenly to the pavilion elder. The man confirmed that it was exciting, and Shu decided to please him by saying that all these bottles would go to the mustachioed man. He tried to refuse, but the guy said that it was unnecessary. However, the man insisted on his own. Then the guy decided to give the bottles to the guy who was standing next to him. The pavilion workers looked at him in shock for a few more seconds. The guy hastened to reassure them that there was no one there and he really wanted to share. He suggested that they take at least 2 bottles, and then they agreed with a smile. Meanwhile, Xiao called the hero into the arena, and the workers started to discuss the guy, saying that they had no idea that he was such a kind person. Meanwhile, the duel between Xu Xiaoshu and Zhou Tianqian began. The swordsman looked smug, and before the start of the fight, he decided to take out his blade. He said that he recognized Xu's strength, and the hero looked at him with anticipation. Zhou said he wanted to take first place in the rankings. The audience realized that he possessed the acquired intent of the blade. This meant that Xu was in danger. Xiao realized that Zhou had been hiding his strength all this time. The hero only mastered the first style of the calm white cloud, and therefore it was difficult for him to match such strength. But he had no plans to give up. That's why he said that Zhou shouldn't wag his tongue. Meanwhile, the spectators were discussing the fact that Shu was the eldest in the outer courtyard. These were the hero's admirers. Meanwhile, Zhou prepared for the duel. Their competition has finally begun. But suddenly Zhou asked Xiao to stop him. The old man thought that it was all Shu's influence, and now everyone had become too impudent. Zhou wanted to make it clear that he was unhappy with Shu killing the guy yesterday. For him, the hero was now an unscrupulous villain. Now Shu asked if Zhou simply wanted to portray him as a murderer, but he immediately backed down. The hero increased the pressure, saying that the guy doesn't know anything. He came here and started throwing dirt at Shu. Tianqian continued to make denials, and the hero put more and more pressure on him morally. He accused him of having people like Zhou who stand on high moral ground and hurt others with their words. Suddenly, the swordsman stumbled. He began to feel ill because of this squabble. He leaned heavily on his sword. Cold sweat began to flow from his forehead. Shu thought that it was time to start the fight. However, Zhou was no longer in a condition to fight. Meanwhile, the hero was mentally rejoicing at this situation, since his opponent turned out to have a delicate soul. Viewers immediately began to insult Zhou for his attempts at slander. Now it seemed to Shu that his opponent was about to give up, and so the hero told him that since Zhou had entered the arena, he must fight. He said the same thing he said to other people who wanted to give up. Zhou thanked him for his instructions with a serious face. Shu looked back at him. Xiao was simply taken aback by the fact that it actually worked. A little later, the guys finally began their duel, and it was clear that Zhou was pushing back his opponent. Shu had a hard time, and his opponent felt strength within himself. For the first time, the hero couldn't defeat anyone, and his power-ups were useless. He needed to get closer to cut the guy down with the tip. Zhou didn't give him any more time to think. Suddenly, Shu concentrated. A moment later, he counterattacked Zhou, and he had to dodge it. He pulled his head back using only reflexes, but the blade managed to catch his hair. Taking advantage of the moment, he charged his sword with energy, and his next attack was supposed to go to the enemy's legs. Shu immediately saw the direction of Zhou's gaze, and he pointed his blade down. Their blows continued to meet each other, and the fight began to look even. Spectators were amazed by the level of this fight. There was a momentary respite in the arena. Shu decided to take the guy seriously. He used his active skill, Nine Tides, and suddenly waves appeared behind him. However, Shu was already concentrating hard, and clouds began to form around him. Their techniques clashed, and the audience froze in anticipation. Xiao watched them with a serious face. Both warriors used all the forces they had. People continued to watch them with bated breath, and Shu began to receive wounds. Zhou's multiple attacks gave him no respite. Tianqian's skill was unmatched, as he could cause serious damage even with a slight cut. The hero began to be covered in wounds. But his life cycle was working at full speed, and therefore the cuts healed quickly. Zhu had already tasted victory, and the waves of his technique almost caught up with the guy. The audience was very worried about the hero. He, in turn, was in excellent condition, and took the blows only in order to copy his opponent's techniques. At the same time, he invested 2 skill points into upgrading his swordsmanship, and his technique began to acquire the same visual characteristics as Zhou's. He hit the guy with his own weapon. The crowd also noticed that Shu's last attack was not like his style. Xu made a breakthrough by masterfully changing his fighting technique. Xiao also realized that he had changed his fencing technique, and this was surprising, because no one dared to do such a thing. The hero took a stance and began to provoke his opponent, and he was going to attack anyway. He raised his sword above himself, and waves began to appear around him. The raging water began to be drawn into the sword, and after a couple of seconds the blade turned blue. Shu didn't expect that his opponent still had trump cards. He understood that he couldn't handle this technique, and so I decided to invest another 3 points into swordsmanship. Now his skill was already at level 6. Insights came into his head again, and the body automatically adapted to the new knowledge. He assumed a stance similar to Zhou's. Viewers began to speculate that Shu had stolen the equipment from the boy, and a moment later they simultaneously created their techniques. Zhou's blade vibrated from the force being exerted, but Shu's didn't show any change. He simply drew his blade. Nobody understood what was happening, and Xiao thought that the hero was about to become a dead man. After all, a blue wave of energy was already heading towards Zuya. which he simply cut to pieces and sent the same one to Zhou. However, he was already ready, and the two forces collided in the air, and Shu's aura grew stronger and stronger. Shu began to realize that he was fighting a truly powerful opponent, and so he admired Shu, who had already managed to understand that Zhou was now mentally not in this world. The hero sighed bitterly, and he touched Zhou's forehead with the tip, but he didn't even move. However, a second later he came to, and a furious grimace appeared on his face. He knocked the guy down with his aura, and the scream continued to fill the surrounding area. He lost control of his aura. Zhu realized that Zhou had just reached the innate level of the blade. Now the fight will become much more difficult. And Zhou suddenly thanked Shu for not taking advantage of the guy's weakness, and later the guy decided to give up. Xiao was surprised by this reaction. However, he announced that Shu had won the competition. Zhou felt awkward that the one he called a murderer had spared his life. That's why I wanted to become his friend. However, Shu only turned around to go home as he wanted to quickly get his fencing skills sorted out. The tournament is finally over. A Xiao looked thoughtfully at the guy's back, thinking that he would probably become the greatest swordsman alive. In his opinion, it was the reincarnation of the strongest swordsman. However, the elder soon had to turn to the people. He picked up some kind of piece of wood and struck a pose, and he loudly announced that the competition was over. Shu meanwhile came to the Goose Lake. He thought about the strength of today's swordsman. Zhou was the only one who made the boy use his imagination regarding fencing styles. But suddenly he decided to spit on all this. After all, right now he had more important things to do, namely, that very seed that destroyed his body. He should have gotten rid of it quickly. Meanwhile, the guy already had almost 28,000 points. He shouldn't have had any, but over the last 3 hours of burning he had managed to accumulate some. However, if the seed reached the Sea of Qi, he could die, and therefore he needed to get rid of the seed. Soon night fell, and the guy decided to start cultivating. He put 5 skill points into breathing technique. In general, the guy had no intention of leveling up this skill because it seemed useless. But now it was necessary. There was a risk that he might freeze in the process, so he needed some support. Having sat down, the guy began cultivating. The body was burned and blood came out of all the orifices. The seed's energy had the attribute of fire, but if he could purify it, it would become much stronger. Apparently San had good intentions, but it could have killed the guy. He needed about a month to cultivate, but he might not have time to do it in that time, so he decided to pump in the breathing technique as well. Suddenly it began to dawn on him. The breathing technique was a basic passive skill, and therefore it may have had other applications. Previously, he only used inhalations to absorb pills, but he did not practice exhalations. It might be that he could release some of the energy through exhalation. And so, a moment later, the hero was already pumping his lungs full of air. The seed began to burn rapidly, and the guy started vomiting blood. That night, San decided to follow Shu again, and suddenly I saw that he was dying. But it wasn't like that. Half of Shu's body was covered in ice, and the other half was burning with heat. He ground his teeth with the effort, and his channels began to break. However, the heart continued to beat. But the guy wasn't going to give up. The world around seemed to freeze. The hero, in turn, brought the pill to his nose. He inhaled it, and as he exhaled, waves of heat went out in all directions. One of them even broke the nearest arch, and a nearby tree was completely blown away. The geese began to scatter, and dead fish began to float to the surface in the lake. The old man decided to see what the boy was doing, but for some reason he suddenly dived into the lake, and at that very moment the guy opened his eyes. He was surprised that he was able to survive. The life cycle, together with the breathing technique, showed a terrifying recovery, and the guy realized that he was receiving too much restorative power. Therefore, there was only one way out to improve the power of the seed directly. He began to inhale the pill again. Aura was gushing out of him, and San was surprised at how he didn't feel pain, yet he believed in him. In fact, the hero was in complete ecstasy at this time. Meanwhile, Goose Lake froze in anticipation. After hearing the sounds of the pogrom, guards came running here, and something jumped out of the water. The bearded creature declared that the guards needed to leave. The guys recognized him as the deputy head. Someone started asking him where he had been, but his colleague ordered him to shut up. They bowed before the old man and accepted his order, and a moment later they disappeared. The old man decided to take off his Panama hat. Goose Lake is destined for peace tonight, but the railings could still use some repairs. The next day, the crowd gathered in the arena again. People heard the sounds of pogroms on the lake, but could not understand what it was. Some people couldn't get enough sleep because of this. After a night of cultivation, Shu was able to absorb the seed and break through to the peak of the 7th stage. But this was difficult for him, because he had not slept for 2 days and he was feeling sleepy. And having dozed off on a bench, a certain man began to wake him up. Shu opened his eyes suddenly, startling the man. The boy was unhappy that he was woken up, but the mustachioed man declared that the competition had already begun. The hero walked to the center of the arena and the spectators cheered him on. For this, he received 1,000 passivity points. He already had 46,000 in currency accumulated in his account. The guy's opponent was a beautiful girl, Li Chenjing. Su then began to give instructions again so that the enemy would not dare to surrender. But the girl already knew it by heart. She approached the guy and said that she had been watching him and thought he was cool. Unexpectedly for Shu, there was an admirer among his rivals. He agreed to give her an autograph, and she smiled triumphantly. However, their duel soon began. The hero gave her the right to attack first, but the girl immediately gave up. The guy was upset because his line was stolen and he wasn't even allowed to earn any passivity points. The girl explained this by saying that she didn't want to get hurt, since there would be rating fights soon. Xiao calmly awarded the victory to the guy. The audience was unhappy with this arrangement. Now the girl brazenly approached Shu, asking him for an autograph. This made the guy feel embarrassed, and the girl then asked him to sign her palm. Suddenly she noticed her friend in the stands. She furiously declared that she would kill Li because she was pestering Shu. But the blonde just grimaced, because her friend was to blame for not training. Zhu meanwhile took out a huge brush. He asked the girl not to give herself up to anyone again, and she responded to his concerns with embarrassment. Now there was a signature on her palm, and she thanked the black-haired man with a red face. The girl started to leave, and Shu called out to her, asking her to take her brush, but she said that she was giving it away. Xiao meanwhile also became embarrassed, and the hero didn't understand anything at all. Meanwhile, Li was walking out of the arena, and her friend was flying towards her, intending to give her a hard time. But the blonde put her hand in front of her, defending herself with Shu's signature. Sometime later, the hero was already sitting in the waiting room. He was already in the quarterfinals, and if he wins today, he will fight for the championship tomorrow. Innate skills in this world were divided into 3 realms: the Garden of Life, Hermitage, and Spiritual Elevation. After the 10th stage of tempering the spirit, the master can awaken the power of an innate attribute within himself, which will depend on the person. But Shu didn't have an attribute, so he was stronger than the others. Even if the students try their best, they won't be able to defeat him. Meanwhile, the guy had more than 48,000 passivity points. Right now, the guy had 5 skills, 2 of which remained at level 6. He decided to keep 10,000 points and spend the rest. A moment later, he activated the roulette, and his friends have already noticed him. They quietly watched what would happen to the guy now. The guy's eyes began to take on a crazy hue again. After all, he was unlucky again, and for 10 keys, he did not receive a single skill. The guys suddenly ran out to him, asking if he needed help. It was becoming increasingly difficult for the hero to gain new skills because of this broken system. He told the people that he was fine and they could go, and they were really worried about him. And instead of leaving, they settled back around the corner. The guy was very upset because he lost 10,000 points again. Last time, skills were much more readily available. However, he decided to rely on luck again, and the roulette started spinning again, and his eyes lit up at that moment. Finally, he gained a new skill called Perception. He immediately jumped up in delight, and so abruptly that he flew into the ceiling, and his head got stuck in it. And his friends began to be indignant that they would have to fix it at their own expense. After finishing their squabble, they thought about whether they should help him. The hero got his head stuck in the ceiling, but still somehow saw the 2 guys below. The radius of its visibility was several meters, and beyond that the image became blurry. However, the skill was indeed useful. One of the workers has already brought a ladder, but Shu playfully climbed out of the hole and said that it was not necessary to do this. He landed softly on the ground, and so I immediately received 2 points for curses. The guy decided to invest 10 points into perception at once. The skill became innate, and the range of perception expanded to 10 meters, and the image became clearer. Now he saw the guys hiding behind the wall, and one of them thought that he really saw them. He had noticed them before, but now he even heard details of their conversation. It was like a video camera, which the hero was clearly happy about. He decided to buy 10 more keys. After purchasing, he touched them in his inventory. Excitement flared up in his mind, and the men immediately heard sobs, because again nothing had fallen out for him. Usati began counting to 3, and they ran to grab him. The guys thought he was feeling ill again, but he tried to fight them off, and sometime later he stood and washed his hands in a tub. If he hadn't covered his mouth with his hands recently, he might have lost his first kiss. And now the 2 debauchees lay tied up on the floor. Something was happening in the arena. A certain Mu Zixi easily defeated her opponent using the giant vine technique. The spectators could not believe their eyes, because this girl had only recently entered the spiritual palace. Her opponent flew straight towards Shu. He received a warning about a sneak attack and immediately turned around. And mistaking the head for a watermelon, he immediately caught it with his hand. The poor guy's body flew into Shu, but he didn't remain in debt, and so he immediately kicked him back. And the mortal carcass fell into the arena. Everyone felt sorry for the guy because he received 2 critical hits in a row. The doctors immediately jumped into the hall to see Shu, but he gestured that everything was fine with him. Then they went down to the victim. Zhu saw the curse notifications from this fighter, so he decided to go down. His acquaintances thought that he was going to cripple him, but the hero only explained that he felt the boy's resentment. He, in turn, tried to convince everyone that everything was fine with him. Zhu raised his hands in a conciliatory gesture and said he just wanted to make sure the boy was healthy. However, the white-haired man continued to panic, but they were distracted by the examiner's voice. Now there was supposed to be a duel between Xu Xiaoshou and Chao Qingteng. The hero will have to fight against the innate master, the second in the palace ranking. Toothy continued to mock Shu, which he immediately sensed. He decided to approach the boy, and he started to panic again. Everyone asked Shu to stop. But now the medical staff has run away and left the guy alone. Zhu ran up to him and said that he wanted to set his bones and give him a pill. This did not calm the toothy one, and in the next moments, a scream filled the arena. In this way, Shu set his bones. Meanwhile, that same girl entered the arena. She cheerfully approached the hero from behind, and lightly hitting him on the head, she said that the elder was calling him. Zhu continued to fiddle with the boy, trying to give him a pill, and she asked how he could be cured just by smelling the medicine and not by taking it. The hero realized his mistake, because he alone knows the breathing technique. Meanwhile, foam was already coming out of the toothy one's mouth. A Shu lightly popped the pill into his mouth. Meanwhile, Xiao came himself and started shouting at the hero. Suddenly, he asked who this girl was. She introduced herself with a smile. He greeted her sullenly and immediately said goodbye, receiving curses in his back. Meanwhile, Shu's opponent was waiting for him humbly. He immediately recognized the power of the innate attribute. This was a very dangerous opponent. Zhu remained a little mesmerized by the falling snow around them. His opponent's strength made itself known even without being revealed. Meanwhile, Shu's fans were nervously licking their lips because of the overwhelming number of handsome guys in the arena. The hero decided to accuse his opponent of cheating, since he influences the local situation even before the competition. In response to this, Shu received a mental mockery. The guy took it as a challenge, and Xiao couldn't understand why this snow was bothering him. Shu didn't know what this snow was for, but he said that he was just cold. However, it was still worth playing it safe. The spectators were unhappy with the length of the fight. The black-haired man refused to give in, but the hero said that it would still be cheating. Chao decided to find out what his opponent was trying to achieve. Shu then suggested that they open the barrier so that he could bask in the sun. This was already beginning to irritate his opponent. Then Xiao suggested that they fight at close range. Chao immediately agreed. This was what Shu wanted, so he then asked how close they would stand. This was starting to infuriate Xiao, but Chao only replied that it made no difference to him. Then Shu took it as a challenge again, and coming dangerously close, he asked him if it was okay for him to do this. Chao practically fell backwards, but he agreed, embarrassed. Now Chao's female fans have become more active in the stands. The guys stood close together, and Xiao decided to start the fight. He immediately announced that the competition had begun. Then the guy decided to attack directly. But instead of Qingteng, only his icy figure remained. His opponent immediately replaced himself, and the hero used perception. And then he noticed a cloud appearing behind him. Qingteng also noticed that the guy hits well, and the hero's gaze fell again on the icy figure. It had already managed to fall apart. Shu also praised his opponent, since the technique was not related to snow, which meant he did not cheat. They exchanged concentrated glances, and the hero realized that he could not ignore the snowfall. Also, until he masters Chao's technique, close combat will be useless. And the second one's sword suddenly began to become covered with an icy crust. He immediately attacked Shu with a wave of ice energy. Now the boy understood why no one had been able to cope with his first glacier sword. A moment later, his body was frozen in a block of ice. The audience couldn't believe that the guy lost so easily. However, Chao understood that their duel would not end there, and so he decided to immediately apply the following technique. And a new wave of energy, stronger than the previous one, flew towards Shu. Xiao immediately realized that the ice boy possessed sword intent, and was surprised that for some reason everyone was revealing their trump cards to the hero. Everyone was interested in how the main character would cope with this. Chu no longer believed that Xiaoshu would pull through, as did the elder who looked after him, and the wave was already dangerously close to him. But the block of ice immediately broke apart, and Shu grabbed the wave of energy with his bare hands and threw it on the ground. No one could have even expected such an outcome. It was a new fencing technique. He developed this creative attack during yesterday's fight, but now a new facet of his technique has been revealed to everyone, and a wave of light immediately flew straight into Chao's face. Now Shu looked invincible. After this attack, he decided to quickly track down the enemy and defeat him, and multiple cuts began to fly across the arena. They were pointed in different directions to prevent Chao from escaping, and so he immediately began to get injured. But a toothless smile appeared on his face, and the cuts flew past. The movement style that was unknown to Shu made him hesitate, but thanks to his perception, he was able to see the enemy in advance. An invisible portal appeared behind him, and the spectators couldn't understand why he was hitting his palm into the void. However, a second later, a head began to emerge from the portal. Shock flashed across the faces of the spectators, and Chao realized that his technique had been recognized. Shu responded with a short smile and used the blade. He made a gesture with his hand like a predator, and he hit the enemy with it. Due to his passive skill, Chao's palm was pierced through, and the portal began to close rapidly. Yu said he was right that there was a problem with the snow. Chao was indeed cheating, as his technique worked precisely because of the white cover. Shu was the first one to draw blood from the guy, and the audience realized what he said, and Chao's fans suddenly became fans of his rival. All the spectators became much more animated, which surprised Shu, and Chao suddenly activated his ability. His hands began to form unknown gestures. This was Chao's signature move. The arena began to be covered with blue lines, and from the portal and from Chao's aura, fast and sharp ice flows began to burst out. It was a deadly snowfall, who immediately headed towards Shu. This meant that snowfall was needed not only for movement, but also for this equipment. Every snowflake of technology carried within itself a murderous intent. Everyone was curious to see how Shu would handle this. Many thought he was a dead man. After all, the attack was truly brutal. Shu's body was pierced every second, but the life cycle restored it. However, the pain wasn't as severe compared to when he cultivated the incinerating firefly seed. The guy suddenly realized that he wouldn't be able to block Chao's palm, and so he abruptly decided to invest points in swordsmanship. And a moment later, his sword flew straight at the enemy. The speed was such that no one could dodge, and suddenly a huge hole appeared in Chao's right shoulder. However, he decided to take a suicidal step. Shu certainly didn't expect this. And then a huge boulder appeared around him. It's unclear how, but without most of his shoulder, Chao was able to perform the seal by clasping his hands, and the ice around Shu began to thicken, to become his prison a few seconds later. Now no one doubted that the guy was finished. Sayo realized that it was too late to act, even though he was wary of such deadly tactics, so he was about to stop the competition. However, a star lit up in the sky, and Chao couldn't believe his eyes. It wasn't a star, but Shu's sword, rushing towards him at great speed. It immediately pierced Chao's chest, and a river of blood flowed from his mouth, and the sword immediately spurred him towards the boulder. It was a spiritual sword, which meant that Shu was on the threshold of the sword's innate intent. Zhou was also surprised that the guy had become so strong in just one day. No one could believe that Shu was progressing so quickly. The boulder, meanwhile, split into pieces, and Chao, with the last of his strength, asked what kind of technique it was. Yu said that this was his white cloud technique. They didn't believe him, but both fighters fell to the ground. The hero was conscious and therefore called for doctors. They immediately rushed to help. Yu stated that he didn't need help and that they should treat Chao first. However, some disagreed, but Shu understood that thanks to the life cycle, everything on him would heal in literally a minute. However, the medics were in no hurry to help Chao and stared at the main character. They took him by the limbs, and they realized that there wasn't a scratch on him. No one could believe that he remained unwounded. Then the guy stood up and said that's what he was talking about. So they really had to hurry with Chow. He once again began to ask them to cure the guy. Finally, Chow was able to wake up, and Shu kept trying to convince everyone that he had not been harmed. Chow's ego was shaken by this news, and he immediately passed out. The doctors looked at Shu with extreme disapproval, but he had nothing to say, and he hastened to leave the arena. All the spectators congratulated the guy on his victory, and he waved his hand back at them. Suddenly, he noticed his friends in the stands. He understood Chow's presence, but he didn't understand what Zhou was doing there. Next came the final fight of the quarterfinals, which featured Momo, the #1 ranked fighter. Sue decided to watch her fight. It started quickly and ended quickly. Momo defeated her opponent in a couple of blows, which Shu was unhappy about. After this, the hero decided to leave the arena. At the exit, he came across a fork in the road. The Goose Lake meant mystery and the unknown to him, while the courtyard was comfort and coziness. So he thought about where he really wanted to go, and the action moved to the courtyard, where Shu began to relax in the bath. After that, he decided to lie down, and pleased with himself, he stared at the ceiling. And when he began to inhale the pill, he felt true pleasure. Thanks to this, he broke through to the 8th stage. After refining the seed, he sealed his power, but now he relaxed and easily broke through to the next stage. However, this was still not enough. Meanwhile, there were about 19,000 points of passivity. Without the seed, he received far fewer points because they now only came from spectators and attacks in the arena. Thoughts haunted the guy, and he thought about everything until the night. As a result, he was unable to sleep at all. And so I decided to take a walk down the street. It was quiet outside, so Shu decided to practice. Swordsmanship was different from other skills, which the hero immediately noticed. As he leveled up, he had epiphanies that made his fencing skills better. Frozen on the platform, he concentrated to the limit. Until now, he was impressed by Chao Qingteng's technique, as he separated his sword in tent and attached it to the snowflakes. So the guy decided to do the same thing, but a little differently. He then attached his sword in tent to the stones nearby, and then he swung his sword sharply. However, nothing happened, and the pebbles fell to the ground with a clatter. He tried to steal other people's equipment, but so far it was unsuccessful. At that moment, he was glad that no one saw it, because he would have been ashamed. Robbing the master turned out to be not so easy. Until now, he had been using fencing, but perhaps the answer was to stop using it. And so he decided to move in time with his heart. He didn't have the best talent, because to develop intent, it needs to be trained with spiritual abilities. But the guy did nothing but use his sword intent in battles. This meant he had to come up with a different strategy for the semifinals. The only way to win was to use hidden bitterness to bypass the sword's intent. Before this, he was able to perform several tricks using the first style of Calm Cloud. But in the battle with Chao, he was only able to display his style at the critical moment, and it was then that he felt that the sword had a life of its own. Somehow, at that moment, he managed to create a spiritual weapon. And if he masters this technique, he will even be able to fly on it, which is the privilege of the strongest. So he decided to try to repeat it. Suddenly, his sword began to shake. This showed Shu's closeness to his blade. Suddenly, the guy threw his sword right in front of him, and later he gestured for him to get up. But the sword only fell with a crash. Unfortunately, he was unable to apply the same technique. But he decided not to give up, and he sent the sword far up. After that, he immediately felt that he could control his blade, and his palm rose in a quick gesture. However, the sword turned towards him and flew towards him, which greatly frightened Shu, because he could become a second Chao Qingteng. He managed to dodge at the last moment, and landed painfully on the stone tiles, as is his sword. Progress was already evident, and so the guy decided to continue the experiment, and screams began to be heard more and more often over the yard. After some time, the boy realized that the sword only becomes spiritual when it rises and falls. Now he needed to understand what the difference was between them. He took his sword and pointed the tip straight at his face, and then he brought it to his neck, to then take him up. The guy brought the blade to his neck again, and it began to vibrate. And when he pointed it to the side, the vibration stopped. Zhu began to get angry because his own blade wanted his blood. And in anger, he threw it into the ground. For this, he received a curse through the system, and the sword did not move along the intended trajectory at all. This greatly surprised Shu, as his blade was apparently alive. The final tournament began at noon the next day. All the elders have gathered here, and even some of the people who occupied the top 100 of the palace rating. A certain girl was very happy that she was lucky enough to sit between Chao and Zhou. She lost consciousness from happiness. This time, there were many more spectators than usual. Suddenly, one of them noticed Su. She was popular because she had already mastered the innate sword intent at the age of 14 and was also a student of the famous Xiaoqi Qiu. No one could have imagined that such an important person would come to sit on the stands. The girl sat down and began to look for Shu, but some viewers were sad because Zhao didn't come with her. People also noticed Zhang Xingxun, one of the 33 people in the courtyard. He was a huge man with a beard and very thick eyebrows. He and the red-haired man looked for Shu because he killed Chun. Melky kept trying to find the hero, but he couldn't do anything. This meant that the guy had apparently not arrived yet, but the bull wasn't worried about that. People thought that he had come for Shu's head because Chun knew someone from the courtyard. Moreover, the hero will most likely end up in the courtyard after the tournament, which means that he cannot avoid his fate. Meanwhile, Shu sat in the judge's chair. He sipped his tea peacefully, not worrying about anything. And that's why it suddenly took off. He jumped into the middle of the arena and soon landed softly, to then announce the start of the tournament semifinals. Something appeared in his hand, and Xu Xiaoshuo and Mu Zixi were called to the arena. The semifinals are the battles of natural warriors that everyone has been waiting for. The girl was similar to Su, as she quickly rose to the top immediately after entering, while Shu proved himself to be an unwavering warrior. Meanwhile, Mu confidently moved towards the arena. This did not escape the eyes of the audience, and instead of Shu, some two guys in white came out. The audience began to be indignant because the hero was disappearing somewhere again. However, the two guys didn't understand why they were being yelled at and not at him. Xiao also began to get angry because this was not the first time Shu was late. However, his blade suddenly began to tremble, and people began to look at the sky, where Shu was already hovering on his blade. Some even thought that they were seeing an immortal, but it was just a kid who trained all night. The girls from Shu's fan club screamed joyfully. No one could understand how this was possible if the guy's aura was at the 8th stage. But someone noticed that for some reason the hero had his back turned to everyone, and he continued to float mysteriously in the air. Mu understood what was going on and said that he was flying on the wrong side of the sword. Shu continued to boast, but he himself understood that this was stupid. After all, his sword possessed spiritual perception only when it was directed towards its owner. And so he flew on the wrong side, and the flight took a whole hour. It was really annoying. However, for all his showing off, he received about 4,000 passivity points. However, be that as it may, Xiao was surprised at how quickly Shu was progressing. But surprise immediately gave way to anger, because the hero still had not descended into the arena. Now the guy faced a difficult task of getting down. People believed in him, but some were ready to burst out laughing. Zhu got points for encouragement and felt embarrassed that there were still people cheering him on. Finally, the sword turned downwards, but the guy ran into a barrier. He was very indignant, and a second later he received more than 1,000 points from ridicule. Mu shouted at him that he would not enter without a token, and the guy promised himself to be more careful next time. And so he finally ran to the center of the arena. He also apologized for being late. My husband told him that he was quite a funny guy. The guy got a point for the praise, but he didn't understand where the praise was if her words sounded like mockery. Xiao meanwhile raised his hand and asked the participants to get ready. And now they could begin the duel. Shu immediately pounced on the little girl, and she warned him, saying that she would attack now. Her arms crossed over her chest, and from her green aura, seeds immediately began to fly out at breakneck speed. At first, the guy didn't understand how she planned to fight with them, but then I remembered that she had an innate wood attribute. Mu noticed the panic in Shu's eyes and immediately commanded the seeds to sprout. Huge stems appeared out of nowhere and immediately threw the guy out. And the last stem hit Shu hard in the stomach. The boy's body immediately shot into the sky. What was unusual for him was that all the participants were engaged in fierce battles, and this one was using seeds. Shu decided to summon the sword to take him away from here. But the stem suddenly grabbed the hero. He realized too late that close combat was a mistake. Meanwhile, Amu began to grow a whole garden. Half of the arena was covered with thick stems. In this hell, only Shu's legs were visible. The audience, however, considered it too cruel. And the girl laughed and squeezed the stems in the place where the guy was. And now there was only a huge cocoon of stems around him. People couldn't understand what the girl was going to do. and the girl, smiling, shouted something about an explosion. And surprisingly, the stems actually exploded. Instead of a cocoon, a huge funnel appeared. Even Xiao couldn't believe it. He became serious in an instant, and the spectators' eyes widened. Shu, meanwhile, did not show up. New plants were already rushing to grow directly from the stone. No one could have imagined that the guy could survive after this. However, Mu, thanks to the secret parasitic seed, sensed that Shu was still alive. But she was already preparing a new reception for him. And in the haze, the silhouette of a guy began to appear. People were surprised by Shu's resilience. Meanwhile, he became increasingly surprised by the power of his innate attributes. And between the opponents, there was a viscous silence, interrupted only by the sound of stones breaking from the growth of stems. Spectators were outraged that Shu did not try to force her into close combat. The girl, meanwhile, used the following skill. It was called a tree barrier, and the long stems of the plants immediately rushed towards the guy. Some impressionable people in the stands already covered their hands, preparing for Shu's death. But suddenly the others noticed that the hero had taken out his scabbard. He dodged the attack, jumping nimbly along the stems, and then he stood in place, trying to concentrate. He closed his eyes with the effort, and the stones around him began to vibrate. And then they started doing the same with scabbards. And even Mu herself began to vibrate. This aura spread throughout the entire arena. Zhu spread his sword intent throughout the arena, and even his opponent became his sword. Xiao couldn't believe what he was seeing, because it was a sword technique of all existence that surpassed even the Palace Master's skills. The hero, meanwhile, put his sword back into its sheath. But he did this only to soon draw his blade again. An aura flowed around him, and the sword settled back into its sheath. The tension eased, and no one could understand why nothing was happening. Mu also did not feel any disturbances, and therefore decided to act on her own. The girl used her power again. Stems immediately grew out of the stone, heading towards the enemy. The particularly impressionable closed their eyes again. But Shu wasn't worried. He just started to take out his blade. However, it happened so quickly that no one noticed, and the stems in front of Shu suddenly stopped. And unexpectedly for everyone, they attacked their mistress. The audience thought she had simply hit the wrong target. Only Su noticed that Shu instantly pulled out his sword and immediately chopped up many leaves. Even ordinary falling leaves were given this honor. And at that very moment, they became divided into two equal parts. Zhu continued to stand in the same stance, and the stems around him broke off in the blink of an eye. But suddenly a powerful explosion thundered. People started to think that the guy was progressing too quickly, and the explosion left no traces on him at all. Meanwhile, the guy couldn't understand why the girl dodged the last attack, and she thought that if there had not been a parasitic seed in Zuya, she would have already been chopped into pieces. She was infuriated by the fact that her opponent was ready to go all the way, and so she decided to pull out her main trump card. And immediately a round green seed took off into flight. A huge stem burst out of it in flight. Chao was surprised by the girl's resilience, who continued to fight even after what Shu showed her. The audience thought she was suicidal because the girl decided to resort to close combat. Shu was pleased with this decision, and a moment later he himself rushed into the attack. Two bodies rushed towards each other. Mu flew from above, pointing her fist downwards, and Shu did the same thing but in reverse. The distance between them was rapidly decreasing. But instead of clashing and fighting with fists, Mu decided to grab the guy and braid her stems around his arm. He found himself tied up again. What he saw was just a copy, and the real Mu was behind him like a snake. He tried to get out of her grip, but it was no use. One of the stems broke away and climbed towards his side, and then he pierced him. Shu was immediately struck by a flash of rage at the pain caused to him, and immediately several more stems that the girl had called upon began to stick into it. It was a truly disgusting fighting style. Zhu called her a parasite, and Mu became extremely angry because of this, promising that she would make a flower out of him. And a flower really did appear on his head. This made the audience laugh, and even Su began to chuckle. Shu was bothered by the fact that even with his perception, he couldn't see the seeds in his body, and because of the seed in his head, he completely lost control of his body. He had already used his main trump card that he had trained all night, but he had gotten into such a mess. Suddenly Mu came up to him and started sniffing his neck. She thought the guy smelled extremely nice. Su had an infinitely absurd life force which seduces the girl, and so she decided to taste it, which the hero was not at all happy about. But she didn't care much, so she clung to his neck like a vampire. Even the spectators realized that this was not normal, and so they were surprised that the judge did not separate them. But Xiao thought she was just playing around. However, he decided that Shu should be saved immediately in any case. But for some reason, the hero's face expressed the extreme degree of ecstasy. The old man was simply taken aback by such emotions on his face. But Shu wasn't worried, because thanks to his skill, he literally had endless life force. Amu almost started to cry because of how attractive his power was. The audience also understood everything, in addition to why Shu literally has endless life force. Someone suddenly noticed that the hero had finally started moving. He tried to get away from her in some way so that she wouldn't notice the attack. And a moment later, the boy used the tip, separating a flower from the top of his head. Amu still continued to suck the power from him. The guy managed to gain control over most of his body, but one shoulder and kidneys were still under the girl's control. After using the point repeatedly, he immediately separated all the stems from himself. And then he grabbed the girl by the neck, but she protested, saying that she wanted to suck more strength. She began to kick, trying to get out from under his grip. And then she even declared that she liked sucking. Yu simply couldn't find the words to say anything in response to her. Now he was thinking about what he should do. However, Xiao simply stopped their fight, and the girl tried to protest. But Shu had no intention of letting her out of his grip, and then he completely covered her mouth with his other hand. The girl didn't remain in debt and immediately bit his fingers. He called her a mad dog and tried to discipline her. To do this, he led her to the edge of the arena. She tried to resist, but was already on her last legs. Then the guy let her go, sending her over the edge of the arena. He put his hand to his sore shoulder, and on his palm there was still some saliva that Mu had left for him. He called it an abomination, and she began to curse him. Finally, Xiao announced that Xu Xiaoshou had won this match. Some people were unhappy with how difficult it was for the guy to win, but it was already a semi-final, so it was to be expected. At last year's tournament, roughly the same thing happened. Meanwhile, Xu hurried away from the arena. Muzixi was very strong and allowed the boy to expand his combat sense. Now he learned how different fighting techniques can be, so he decided to take some time to meditate. But someone interrupted him. It was a mustachioed man who came with some message from Qiao. He had already thought that this was a message from the elders themselves, but there was only something written there about the sealing technique, after which the letter immediately caught fire in his hands, and a moment later there was nothing left of him. He thought that it was related to Momo, whom he would fight in the finals, and the message was necessary because no one knew about her abilities. Meanwhile, the girl fought her opponent in the semi-finals. The audience was dissatisfied with the performance because she again pushed her opponent away with her left hand, while holding a copper stove in her right. There was a candle in it, smoldering steadily. Baldy pointed out that he himself probably wouldn't be able to defeat Mo, even though she was at the initial stage of the Yuanting stage. The redhead thought that he could try to defeat her quickly, without dragging out the fight. Although they didn't know her abilities, one thing was clear: with each attack she reduced the enemy's abilities. Suddenly, the red-haired man asked Brother Xiang what he thought about the ending. He also said sarcastically that Shu's innate body didn't stand a chance. Sometime later, the finale finally arrived. Shu flew around the area and collected passivity points. He enjoyed these performances, because in the end, he still ended up in the black. Mo had already approached the arena, and so the guy decided to dive there. He managed to take a token in advance, which allows him to pass through the barrier, and so he landed easily on the ground. Mo approached the guy, saying that she had been watching him and noticed that he liked to joke. In her right hand, she held a copper stove. Shu, without hesitation, immediately said that he thought the girl was beautiful. She was flattered, because this was the first time someone had said something like this to her face. But Shu suddenly began to deny it, saying that he was talking about the stove. Now irritation began to appear on Mo's face. Trying to smooth things over, the guy said that the girl was also not bad, but her stove was much more beautiful. He received a passivity point for the curse and was confused. Now the hero came closer, asking to look at the stove. She reluctantly agreed because he paid her a compliment. The guy lowered himself a little and stared intently at the copper structure. The girl felt a little embarrassed by this, and then she accidentally handed the stove into his hands. She didn't want to do this, and so her face immediately took on an undefined emotion. The guy apologized for being abrupt, but said that he was very interested in this thing. Mo thought he was sincere and therefore didn't argue. Meanwhile, the spectators could not understand why the fight had not yet begun. The boy's interest in the stove was due to the fact that he felt some kind of frightening energy in it. It was impossible to feel it without touching, but when he touched the girl's right hand, he realized that it contained 10 times more energy than the rest of the body. As we know, she only used her left hand, which meant that she was a real monster. And when he remembered about the sealing technique, he even thought that her eyes were bandaged all over her right arm. Now the guy carefully handed the stove back. He moved away to a respectful distance, and Mo didn't understand why he did this if he was a close combat fighter like her. Shu was surprised by this because it sounded like a joke. He explained that he was a fencer, and the girl thought after these words. The guy asked for a head start, saying that she was a strong practitioner of the innate level, and therefore he would like to make the first strike with the sword. Such conversations were not commonplace, but Mo still agreed to the conditions. A xiao announced the start of the duel. Now Shu used the north wind style, and the girl parried the attack with her bare hands. The guy was very surprised because it was a close combat technique, but honed to such a level that its speed erased even the afterimages of attacks. Now it was time for Mo to get involved. She suddenly rushed towards the guy. However, Shu didn't want to fight against the sealing technique, so he decided not to let it touch his body. But for every attack, there was a counterpunch with the hands. At this rate, she could break his sword, and so the guy decided to act preemptively, using close combat. He abruptly dropped his sword and met Mo's attack with a grab, and then he attacked her in the stomach. Then he pulled his palm out of his fist, giving even more inertia to the girl's body. She flew off a decent distance. The audience believed that Shu would be able to defeat her, but suddenly someone noticed that the guy's face had changed. The hero realized that this was indeed the power of sealing, because while Mo stood nearby, all his abilities were turned off. This frightened him, because such an attribute was very scary. At that moment, Mo looked strangely at her right hand, and at that moment, for some reason, she began to shake. Shu decided that he should still use the sword. He decided to cheat a little and improve his abilities right in the middle of the fight. His swordsmanship, meanwhile, had reached level 10. He looked sternly at the girl and said that she was really strong. She responded in kind, and Shu received 1 passivity point for his confession. However, the hero was going to become much more serious. His skill has leveled up to the first level of innateness, and everyone in the arena started shaking. Even Xiao didn't immediately understand what was happening. Suddenly, people's blades started to fly. Now, instead of the usual shaking, they rose into the air. Meanwhile, Shu prepared to attack. This oppressive aura was building up around the barrier. But later, it finally dissipated, and the swords returned to their owners. Xiao realized that this was indeed the sword's innate intent. The guy's aura changed, and his gaze expressed extreme concentration. Mo looked a little battered. Many spectators couldn't believe their eyes, as this skill was only awakened in people once every 100 years, and only recently had Su Qianqian mastered it. The guy stood there and laughed a little. He didn't expect the intent to break through the barrier, but it did, giving him a lot of passivity points. The girl thought that the break had already dragged on too long, and the guy was quite surprised, realizing that she had been waiting for him on purpose until he came to his senses. Now he was ready to fight. His gaze focused on the girl, and his hand tightly gripped the hilt of the sword. He sharply moved his hand towards the girl, and a wave of cutting followed in that direction. However, Mo simply raised her hands, blocking the attack. This sealing technique was a real scam. Then the guy used a different fencing style, and now a multitude of cutting waves flew at the girl. The spectators kept guessing how the fight would end, because Shu didn't give her time to come to her senses. Just in case, he decided to strike again. However, something went wrong. At that very moment, his spiritual strength was exhausted, and he went into hand-to-hand combat while Mo reflected the consequences of his attacks. The waves hit her hands in succession, and she tried to defend herself. The force of inertia pushed her back more and more. But then the girl suddenly inhaled a lot of air into her lungs. She used some breathing technique and her eyes filled with power, and the girl immediately crushed all of Shu's previous attacks. He clearly didn't expect this, and so he had to run back. However, Mo looked shabby. The hero thought that sealing the technique took a lot of her strength, and so he decided to attack. The spectators laughed a little at Shu's fighting style, but then thought that they themselves would have fled the arena if they saw their innate sword intent fade away. Su made a dash towards the girl, but at the last moment he realized that now was the worst moment to attack, because the girl had already managed to get ready. His hand almost reached the girl, but she immediately raised her palms in front of herself and applied the seal of tempering heaven and earth. However, the guy had no doubt that she would miss the moment, and at that moment a chain flew out of a crack in space. She immediately entangled Shu's hand. like all the other chains that bound him in all parts of his body. Shu couldn't understand what kind of technique this was and why it was so strong. Even Xiao had never encountered such a spiritual ability, since it wasn't from their pavilion. People started to wonder who this Mo was. The ability was at the level of a great master, which was very rare even in the inner courtyard. Shu immediately tried to use the tip, but nothing came of it, and he became depressed. Now all he could do was watch as he was attacked. He became scared, and then he felt the urge to go to the toilet. Now Mo has applied some kind of fusion, and lava began to flow from the cracks in space. The chains began to heat up quickly, threatening the boy's limbs. It looked extremely abnormal. Shu nervously shouted that Mo wasn't giving him a chance. However, she had no intention of stopping, and Shu's hand immediately began to melt. Lava flowed through his limbs and melted through his shoulders. However, the guy had already experienced something similar when absorbing the semen of the incinerating fireflies. But now the pain was much weaker. That's why he immediately told the girl about it. Xiao looked at him as if he was crazy. People realized that Shu was not just lucky, because not everyone could endure such pain from melting. Meanwhile, Su sat with her eyes closed, and everyone else stared at Shu with interest. Meanwhile, the hero was still hanging in chains. Xiao was wondering if the guy could hold out or if he should finish the fight. At that moment, Mo exhaled heavily, but the hero still felt a burning pain. He could have died if this had continued, so the guy decided that he should start heating up the magma inside his body. Shu knew it would hurt, but there was nothing he could do. Throwing up her pendant with her chest, a pill flew out. He immediately threw it into his mouth, and then he began to apply the breathing skill. And it really started to work. The audience thought this move was too cruel, but they continued to believe in Shu. However, Mo was convinced that the chains had not worked, which meant that she would have to use her trump card. She grabbed her right shoulder with her left hand, and she began to concentrate for the last dose. Zhu tried to stop her, but she wasn't going to follow his lead, because she needed to finish the fight. She held both hands out in front of her in a certain gesture, and Shu frantically tried to think of how to free himself from this cage. Suddenly, the chains began to shake violently. As Shu concentrated, the spectators' swords began to rise again. Sayo recognized this as the same sword technique that the hero had used in the previous battle. He managed to get to know the special key of his sword, and the sword key that Momo had absorbed had not yet been purified. His blade had an aura that made it unable to rise against the wind and waves. However, he could still use the reverse sword style, and his blade immediately rushed towards him. However, before the collision, he severed the connection. The audience couldn't understand what he was going to do, but suddenly they noticed that something was wrong with Mo's body. She was extremely angry at what Shu started doing to her stomach. However, the guy immediately used this technique again. His blade began to rise, but he immediately cut off the connection, and the energy that absorbed Mo began to traumatize her. This embarrassed her greatly. However, Shu had no plans to stop, and the sword still rose. And later he fell. Mo's belly continued to swell, trying to pull himself closer to Shu. People have already started to think that this is too much, but the hero didn't even think of stopping, and the girl felt spasms all this time. She screamed loudly at the guy, but he began to use and cancel the technique even more often, and his sword never stopped moving. Then the girl could no longer hold on and moaned loudly. This embarrassed her so much that her whole face turned red, and he started to smile but still continued, and the sword began to descend and fall again. Their fight turned into something depraved. The spectators simply could not believe what was happening in the tournament final. Xiao also saw something like this for the first time. Shu began to burst into laughter, with blood pouring out of his mouth. Laughter also erupted from the stands. Someone had a disgusting laugh, and everyone started looking at this person sideways. But it was Elder Chow, so no one could say a word to him. The old man continued to laugh at Shu. The guy finally believed that he had a way out of this situation, and Mo was extremely angry with him. She continued to prepare for her final trump card. Yu sensed danger and tried to use the reverse sword technique, but the girl resisted the impulses. However, this time the guy did not abandon the technique, and the blade flew straight at him. He hit the ring with the tip, and later he disappeared altogether, ending up in subspace. Now, having gotten rid of the blade, he could use the technique at full power. And then the sword's full innate intent was put into action. Mo couldn't seal the blade's key inside herself, so blood immediately started coming out of her mouth. The girl's body immediately rose into the air. A Xiao realized that Shu had developed to the point where he could use his power to control other people's bodies. Now the girl was also tied in the air. She became crucified by his technique. Finally, the girl felt Shu's pain, and then she started asking to let her go. The two rivals were hanging in the air, and Shu said that she started it first, and therefore he was not going to let her go. However, she did not admit her mistake. That's why the hero had no intention of letting her go. The spectators burst into laughter again as both warriors were tied up and bleeding. Mo didn't have a natural body and was only able to survive thanks to the surge of life force from her right hand, and the essence within her began to tire. Therefore, the girl still agreed with the guy, letting him go first. And he was instantly glad that the life cycle had managed to restore most of his body. Now it was Shu's turn. But he said that he could not free her because he had lost control of the kui of his sword. Mo got angry again, and her hand immediately dropped. Because of which, an unknown force descended along the chains and passed onto Shu's hand. Suddenly, the ring on his chest rose, and a sword flew out of it. The blade was drawn to the guy, and he pushed it with his forehead, filled with energy, and the sword immediately flew forward. It was similar to the move he used to defeat Chao. Mo tried to play her last trump card, but she didn't have time, because the sealing technique limited her, and Shu had already almost caught up with the girl. And the sword really did return to him. Zhu began to pour the last bits of spiritual energy into it to give the blade even more acceleration. And then he darted like an arrow into the girl's back. The blade easily pierced Mo, getting stuck inside her. And then her body collided with Shu's body. Now they were sealed together. The audience thought it was cruel because he got there on his own. He was in extreme pain. It was clear from the girl that she, too, was going through some rather difficult feelings. And because of this, her chain technique became unusable. Then the guy held the girl so that she wouldn't fall on the sword, and together they fell to the ground. The sword was immediately put away, and Shu took out a pill from his spatial pocket. He decided to save the girl as quickly as possible, and he threw the pill into her mouth. A xiao announced the end of the match and Shu's victory. Meanwhile, the audience discussed what they saw, and the head of the pavilion immediately called the doctors. Usagi asked if Shu needed treatment, but he refused. However, he decided not to let them go without a gift, and so he handed the mustachioed man 5 fried pieces of leather. He didn't accept the gift and thought that he was sorry that the magma hadn't swallowed this idiot. After this, Shu was left alone with Xiao. He read from a sheet of paper saying that he congratulated the guy. But Shu didn't expect any other outcome. He would have won the tournament anyway. Xiao went on to say how surprised he was by the boy's skills throughout the tournament. But it sounded more like a mockery, which Shu took personally. Still, the old man was glad that such a man was able to win the tournament, because Xiao thought that he worked tirelessly. However, only the hero knew about his pumping system. Now the old man decided to move on to rewards. And in the blink of an eye, several pedestals appeared in front of them, and all of Shu's last opponents began to climb into the arena. He greeted them, and Xiao congratulated the guy on his victory. From the little one, he received only a curse, and Mo ignored him completely. Shu felt quite hurt because he saved the girl when she could have fallen on her sword. Now the moment for the award ceremony has arrived. Yu received the second spatial ring. A Xiao explained that the top 10 would be able to enter the spiritual treasure pavilion to select an ability, and the top 3 would be rewarded with an innate pill. The spectators were surprised that they would be allowed to enter the spiritual treasures pavilion. The Linkang Pavilion is one of the most important pavilions in the Palace of Heavenly Silk, as it houses countless spiritual techniques. And the 8th rank innate Dan pill increases the chance of breaking through to the innate stage by 30%. But this year, the top 3 winners turned out to be special, and only Shu will be able to use this pill. The strength of the participants this year was too high, and this pill no longer seemed so attractive. However, Shu was pleased. He couldn't get into the palace for 3 years, so he didn't have any strong skills. But he was pleased with himself that even under such conditions he had achieved victory. Now Xiao moved on to the main thing, to the quotas for the inner courtyard. For many years, no one was allowed in there except Su Qianqian. The first to pass the quota was Zhou Tiankan. He was even taken aback for a second because he didn't expect to be taken there. Everyone thought that the demands had been lowered, since Zhou had already been beaten by Shu. The second to qualify was Chao Qingteng. There were already 2 people, which greatly surprised the audience. Muzixi and Momo passed through the 3rd and 4th quotas. However, these girls didn't expect anything else. All those named were at the innate level. But no one thought that Shu would be allowed in there, because he was only at the 8th stage. and only those born were allowed into the inner courtyard. The guy got 2,000 points just because people were worried about him, and Xiao still maintained tension. And apparently, luck was not on his side. The tournament participants were also taken aback. Everyone was unhappy, because Shu had shown unprecedented skills and, moreover, was the champion. Zhou then decided to give up his position. Xiao was irritated, and an awkward silence hung between them. Shu tried to keep a straight face, but the old man saw bitterness in his eyes. Then Xiao sighed heavily. Shu covered his nose with his hand to avoid getting infected by the dirty old man. The grandfather understood everything correctly and managed to get a little angry because he had just begun to feel sympathy for the guy. He put his hand on Shu's shoulder and said that he could stay in the outer courtyard for a year and try to break through to the innate. This was a good option, since the hero should have already been kicked out of the palace, but they decided to leave him, and this meant that someone put in a good word for him. The guy turned towards the podium where Xiao was sitting, nodding to him. Then Shu thanked Xiao. At this point, the tournament ended, and Xiao hurried to approach the main character. He asked Shu if he was disappointed, and he agreed, but the old man said that life was always about ups and downs. So the grandfather decided to congratulate the boy himself, giving him 2 elixirs. The next day came, it was sunny and calm. Hugh managed to get a good night's sleep, but someone was already knocking on his door. The guy hurried to open it and asked with a displeased face who was there. It was the messenger who said that Elder Xiao was waiting for Shu. The Linkang Pavilion is located in the inner courtyard, which has much more spiritual energy. Xiao explained once again that each of the arrivals could choose one innate technique, and they were forbidden to make noise here. If you anger the scroll keepers, they will turn your bones into ashes with fire. Shu asked guiltily why Xiao was looking at him when he said this, but the old man said that he was not hiding the fact that he was saying this to the guy. The people around Shu laughed good-naturedly, and the hero felt uncomfortable. But after some time, they still went to the pavilion. Shu was surprised that Zhou was also there, so he approached him and asked what he was doing there. Pressing him, he said that the guy could tell it in secret and no one would know anything. But he still pulled back, deciding not to make the guy nervous. And together they went up to the pavilion. One of the guys remarked that they had finally arrived. And indeed, a huge building stood before them. Sometime later, they reached the doors. A Xiao stood in front, holding the token with him. He picked it up and shook it in front of the door, and the door immediately opened in front of them. The old man explained that acquired techniques were recorded on the first floor, innate ones on the second, and the path to the third was closed to them. The pavilion looked small from the outside, but inside there was a whole world. Shu was very interested in what was in these books. He looked through them slowly, and then he took one of them. Zhou couldn't understand what the guy was doing on the first floor. He looked at the guy and thought that he was throwing around ancient tomes, so Zhou decided to go up to him and stop him. He asked what he was doing, and Shu calmly replied that he was looking for equipment. Zhou said that if he continued to treat the books like that, the keeper of the scrolls would come for him. But Shu knew what he was doing. He explained that the scrolls were protected by arrays, and if his friends started screaming, then they would get into trouble. The hero said that golden pages and fragments of ancient scrolls are often hidden in seemingly harmless volumes. So Shu ignored the guy and continued doing the same thing. Shu decided to join him, but so far they haven't found anything. Zhou realized that Shu had become so strong because of his atypical thinking. The hero asked him to sort out dust-covered corners and books, and he thought that this was the champion's logic. Shu hoped that fools had good luck, and so he placed great hope in Zhou. Meanwhile, on the second floor, there were some white circles. Mei woke up first. The rest of the people sat in these circles and meditated, and the girl decided to go down. It was still quiet on the first floor. Meanwhile, Zhou was shaking out the books. She turned to him, menacingly asking what he was doing. He panicked, thinking that the keeper of the scrolls had come to him. The girl asked him again what he was doing. The guy explained that he was trying to find equipment, but she didn't believe him, not understanding why he was rummaging around in the dust. Zhou responded that Shu was doing the same thing, but in fact, he was standing and peacefully reading a book. The pose was quite expressive, which made Mu feel embarrassed. But suddenly she remembered that Shu had called her disgusting, and her mood plummeted. However, the girl didn't show it. The hero found many different fragments of techniques, but they all had specific properties that did not suit him. Only the 10 pointing swords were unranked, but when perfected, it could cut through the heavenly river with one touch. Mu decided to look for equipment in the same way. But she didn't succeed, so she started yelling at Joe. He explained that if she wanted to succeed, she had to try her best. The girl started laughing because the guy was covered in dust. Suddenly, he called her to him. She thought he had found something. It was some kind of ancient scroll. At first glance, he was perfect for Joe, but not for the girl. The guy immediately winced, and she thought he had had an epiphany. Mew realized that Shu was right about the treasures on the first floor. Someone agreed with her, standing behind her, but she didn't understand who it was. This really scared the girl, and in front of her she saw San's face. The unexpected closeness left her stunned, and she fainted. The old man just grinned at this reaction, and he picked up the book that the girl was holding. A look of surprise immediately flashed in his eyes. He noticed that the girl had a very powerful life force, and later he realized that she could also absorb life force and strengthen her nature. He felt sorry, because if she had appeared before him earlier, he would have chosen her. Ju showed San what he had found, and he was again surprised by the find. The old man became curious about how many insights he had achieved, and he said that there were too many of them, and Shu was right in his assumption. The old man looked at him with a wide smile. Joe was also afraid of such closeness, and he also fainted. San started kicking him somewhere to the side. Now all he had to do was find Shu. He was shaking the books with all his might. But suddenly I noticed someone else's gaze on me. However, he still felt someone, and his friends had disappeared somewhere. He realized that the keeper of the scrolls had come for them. The boy said he felt like shaking the books to shake the dust off them. He then reached for another piece of equipment. But then he simply said that he hadn't found anything and that he should go to the second floor. San realized that he had been exposed, and Shu wrote off his voice as hallucinations. But the old man immediately shouted at him, saying, "Stop pretending." Finally, the guy turned around and feigned surprise. He began to justify himself, saying that he had not harmed the books. But San stopped him, saying that he would not harm Shu and that he had originally come for him. He became interested in what technique the guy had chosen, and he began to take a book out of his cassock. The old man said that it was difficult to even call it a fragment, and the guy would hardly be able to master one of the 10 stages. Later, he took out another scroll. He put the scrap away and now handed the guy another technique. The old man said that he prepared it especially for the guy. It was the technique of heavenly flame of illuminated coals. Shu immediately guessed that this was related to the seed he had previously consumed, so he decided to say that he wouldn't be able to master it. But San said that he doesn't need talent, because the main thing in this technique is to have a dense body. Shu didn't want to suffer again, and San felt him and said that one of the pills had already been melted down quite well and the progress was already halfway. So the old man gave him a pill and said that the guy should register this technique and work hard on it. He reluctantly agreed, but then he decided to say that he didn't want to do it. San smiled sharply, and with a jerk of his hand, he threw the pill forward. She immediately flew into Shu's mouth. He looked sadly at the old man, and he said that if he didn't want to eat it now, he could eat another one for now and leave the first one for later. The guy thought to himself that he didn't want to take any of them. His body immediately began to warm up. Points immediately began to accumulate for receiving damage. At the end, Shu was left with 11 elixirs. He didn't like the fact that strangers were writing his destiny for him. He didn't get into the inner courtyard for the championship, and they didn't even let him choose the equipment. Meanwhile, something was happening in the courtyard of one of the spiritual sites. The kettle stood on a stone that was emitting tongues of flame, and later they poured water from the kettle into 2 small glasses. A girl approached Zhang and offered him a certain drink. He remained silent, and the girl continued to stand in front of him. After this, the bald man said that she should get dressed because her clothes had fallen off, but she explained that she was just running around like that. Then he silently accepted the drink, and then he poured it into his mouth, and then he started staring at the empty glass. The girl moved closer, pouring him water and saying that more news had come from home. It was probably something about Wen, who was recently killed. He was Zhang's subordinate, so the responsibility fell on him. But the bald man still asked how the Wen family's case related to him. Even though he was his cousin, Zhang did not consider him to be of any importance. The girl offered to kill Shu herself. It would be strange if one of the inner court went and killed the tournament champion, but she wanted to do it quietly. Although the girl thought it was just an outer court, Zhang explained that the elders of the law department could not be deceived so easily, and she would have to bear responsibility for her actions. She thought the bald man was worried about her, but he said he just didn't want to ruin his own path for this guy. Some Tianshan County won't be able to hold him, but in 6 months he will be able to get to the capital Dongtian, where he will have room to roam. The girl really liked Zhang for his masculinity, but he didn't notice her at all. Then the bald man warned her that she needed to keep an eye on Xu Xiaoshu, but she needed to act very carefully so that he wouldn't notice anything. She accepted his order and then asked if he would like a drink. He refused, and when asked where he was going, he rudely replied that it was none of her business. The girl started to get angry because he would probably go to that same little Zhao Yin. This angered the man, causing him to frown and order her to repeat it again. The girl also began to get very angry. She said that he had already tried many times to enter her spiritual station, but he had never succeeded, and therefore there was no point in trying again. The bald man pinned the girl to the chair, threateningly telling her that she shouldn't interfere in these things because she was just a servant of the Zhang family. Having disciplined the arrogant girl, the man hurried off to attend to his own business. She burst into tears because she realized that for Zhang, rank and position were an insurmountable barrier. In anger, she threw the cup, which immediately smashed on the wooden floor. And suddenly, someone unexpectedly came to Hou Yuxing. It was a certain guy who was looking at the girl with a serious look. He started picking up the pieces and asked why she did it. But the girl immediately stopped the guy, saying that the jug was broken by her, which meant that she would clean it up too. She also asked me to buy her the same one. The guy accepted the request, but later asked if she needed anything besides the jug. He hit the nail on the head, because a little later the girl said that she needed to kill one person. The guy asked who he should kill, and the girl said that it would be Xu Xiaoshu. Meanwhile, the hero was lying in his room and sneezing. He immediately thought that someone was remembering him, and with this thought he immediately remembered that girl with red hair. However, what worried him even more was that Elder San was acting too frivolously, which meant that he had much more influence than he seemed. And the mere mention of the old man made Xu lose his temper. Trying to get away from his thoughts, he put down one of the tablets on which the technique was written. It was the technique of heavenly flame of illuminated coals. And she didn't even have a rank, and the training method was simple and crude. If Xu could withstand the power of the fire seed, then it could be smelted into the chi of illuminated coals. Meanwhile, the hero had almost 49,000 passive points. It took him about 2 or 3 hours to smelt, which gave an increase in strength and points. And if you melt it down, then you could master the innate fire key in advance. Yu suddenly became interested in what would happen to his breathing technique if he developed it to an innate level. But something unexpected could happen. He already had 5 of the 6 innate skills. And so he decided to take a risk, because the only skill he had acquired was too obvious. And a little later, the breathing method finally became an innate skill of the first level. His body seemed to turn into an energy-collecting array, and his aura rushed inward. In just one moment, he absorbed as much spiritual energy as he had previously lost in an entire night of sleep. The pain was severe and the body involuntarily contracted. But he had to endure this in order to become even stronger. Thick steam immediately burst out of the door of his room. He immediately felt better and decided to continue training. He consoled himself with the thought that the sooner he died, the sooner he would be reborn. And the pill he held in his hand immediately became a victim of the breathing technique. And with just one breath, she immediately crumbled to dust. The hero clearly didn't expect this, and his body was immediately struck by an unprecedented ecstasy that he had never experienced before. He felt so good that he even felt sick. Next, the guy had to get rid of the flame that had settled in his chest. The new breathing method allowed him to exhale not only through his nose, but through his whole body, opening all his pores. The efficiency more than doubled, which made the guy extremely happy. And the effect of the fire seed immediately began to dissolve in the body. It was much faster than the first time, and the pain became duller. And after some time, disappear completely. And the passivity points were replenished very quickly. The fire seed of illuminated coals had disappeared, but the progress in chi formation was only 90% complete. He still had 1 seed left, and he was surprised that the old man had calculated everything. So Xu decided not to put things off and immediately popped the pill into his mouth, and his torment continued. The passivity points grew more and more, reaching 80,000. And after some time, Xu released all the heat that was stored in his body at once. He broke through to the 9th level of spirit tempering, and the color of his power changed from scarlet to ancient white. This was the distinctive feature of the illuminated cold chi technique. What made the guy realize that he had succeeded? His fist was a couple of centimeters from the floor, and an aura emanated from the limb. She began to melt and dissolve the boards. This impressed the guy greatly because the power was truly terrifying. And a little later, only a hole remained in that place. The attacking power was great, especially if the guy adds strength and sharpness to the effect. Next, he needed to condense the heavenly flame of illuminated coals. The technique was dangerous because if he made a small mistake, everything could go up in smoke. And the flame in his hand began to diminish and thicken. Soon, it became completely transparent. Next, he decided to experiment with the spiritual crystal. It had a high density and a good amount of energy. But upon contact with the equipment, the stone began to simply disappear into thin air. Having burned out instantly, it left nothing behind. Then the guy decided to slightly modify the technique. Using invisible flames, it was possible to ignite the air in an instant and then burn everything within the controlled area. Shu couldn't understand why these techniques came so easily to him, since even geniuses needed 2 months. An aura immediately enveloped the boy's body, and his eyes closed in concentration, to then scatter around the room, burning absolutely everything that was around. The effect was not visible to the naked eye, so Shu thought it had failed. However, something behind us started to burn. His bed began to rapidly smoke. Just like everything else in his room, he immediately realized that his house was about to burn down, and he along with it. And so the guy hurried out into the street. The fire reached something flammable, and soon the house exploded. Meanwhile, it was raining outside. He immediately put out the fire in the house, but it had already fallen apart. His poor little house was destroyed again, and Shu started crying. And what was left of the house soon burned out, because the flames released were invisible and could not be extinguished with ordinary rain. Then Shu moved to the guest room. He decided that it was better to experiment and practice dubious things in the yard. Or better yet, right next to the goose lake, since last time he trained next to it, and the destroyed jade railings were repaired in 1 day. And until he gets caught, this could become a free training ground for him. The weather was in no hurry to improve, and the rain, driven by the clouds, continued to beat on the roof tiles. Meanwhile, Shu was thinking about his cunning plans, making a sarcastic expression on his face. He already had over 80,000 passive points. Once he carefully exchanged only a few passive keys, but now he has grown to 50 consecutive pulls. Before the roulette, he wished himself luck, and all his thoughts became focused on getting what he wanted. His entire inventory was filled with keys, which he immediately activated. The first 10 attempts were unsuccessful. This began to make the guy nervous, but he still had some attempts left. It was too early for him to get angry, and so he blessed himself with luck again. However, 10 more attempts were also unsuccessful, giving him 4 keys in return, but no skills. Shu immediately began to offer prayers to the gods, because absolutely everything now depended on luck. Finally, he got a new skill. Shu couldn't believe his eyes as he read the text after using the keys. He now has a new basic passive skill called Full of Energy. The guy was so happy about this that he accidentally smashed the table in front of him to pieces. The name was promising. It was associated with energy. Because of this, the hero decided to look inside himself and later noticed some deviations. The speed of his spiritual power recovery in the Sea of Ki had increased significantly, meaning that his endurance in battle would now be limitless. During the fight with Momo, in the middle of the fight, he almost won, but his third strike never came out because the spiritual power in his body was simply not enough. However, now he had the help of breath, vitality, and a new skill that made him invincible. And after using 20 more keys, he received another skill called Echo. Shu immediately realized that in a pumped-up form, he would also be extremely useful. It was already clear from the name that its function was related to the recoil of the blow. In games, it's not scary if the enemy collects armor, because it was scary when armor reflected damage. But now Shu had both the power and that very effect. The hero hit one fist with the other, but the effect was not quite what he had originally expected. Echo and damage reflection were different things. In his case, it was more like knockback from hits. However, this was also useful, because he could use this skill during an enemy attack to push the opponent away and counterattack. Overall, 2 skills with 50 keys was just what Shu expected, and so a smile appeared on his face. But when he looked at his inventory, he noticed that he had 10 more keys. He immediately realized that in some cases he had been given an extra key, which now gave him 10 more tries. Before the opening, he decided to go to a place he considered lucky, and the moment of truth has finally arrived. But luck was not on his side and he only got 1 key. This made the guy angry, and he started complaining about life again. However, now he had 31,000 points, 20,000 of which he decided to save for skills. Shu thought that his posture could also influence his luck, so he immediately lay down on the floor. The guy prayed to God again and pressed the keys, but he was unlucky again. This threw him off balance, causing him to cough up blood. He was extremely upset that after 10 attempts, he hadn't even managed to get the key. However, he still had 1,000 to spare, and he thought that perhaps a miracle would happen. But the miracle, as expected, did not happen because he had already received too much. The subconscious hope immediately suffered a complete collapse, and after some time, small craters from the guy's righteous anger appeared on the field where he lay. Shu now had a little more than 20,000 points, which he immediately spent on new skills, increasing them to the first innate level. Now he had 8 passive techniques of the innate level, which was good news. The rain continued to fall, creating a not very cheerful atmosphere. However, Shu was happy with life, because now he had become much stronger, and now only a shower and sleep awaited him. But meanwhile, something unusual was happening on Goose Lake. Someone's feet were running across the water, only lightly touching it, creating small waves. It was a certain guy in a hood who was paired with his friend for another mission. He didn't look very collected and allowed himself to calmly wet his throat with alcohol. The second guy said that they shouldn't get distracted, because at this time of day it's easiest to kill a person, which is what they would soon do. But the first one said that he would be fine, noting in response that the second one did not put on his hat, which was a somewhat incomprehensible decision given that it was raining outside. He replied that cold water invigorated him. That's why the first one said that everyone has their own quirks. Some like to drink alcohol, while others like to stand in the rain. He said that the second one looked like a saint, but he immediately cut off this phrase, asking if the first one even understood what he was talking about. The hooded man realized he had said something stupid. After all, his partner was Feng Kun, whose nickname was Bloody Hands. Luckily, the first one came to his senses in time to avoid being even more rude. After some time, they finally reached their destination. The first one tried to say something, but Feng shut him up. They needed to act quietly, so the first one decided that he wanted to go ahead. For such a task, there was no need to resort to strong techniques, since it was enough to hit the victim with one precise blow. The upcoming task put a smile on the man's face, and a sly smile crept across his mouth. An aura flowed through his body, and 2 sharp daggers peeked out from under his cloak, and he went straight to the house. The man decided to act head-on by knocking on the door. Meanwhile, Shu was sleeping peacefully in his bed. This made the hero extremely angry, because someone was preventing him from sleeping again. However, he still got up and quickly went to the door to see who had come to see him. He leaned against the door handle and began to open it. But suddenly a bright thought came into his head, because it was unlikely that anyone would just come looking for him at this time. And so the hero decided to use his perception skill. He noticed that there was a man in a black cloak standing behind the doors, and behind him there was another man. The strange thing was that no one usually goes for a walk in such weather, which meant that something was clearly not right here. The man in the hood thought that no one was home, and so he abruptly brought the dagger behind his back, intending to break the passage. But Feng managed to grab his hand. He shouted out loud that it was Xiao Qiji and ordered the door to be opened. The voice was reproduced with incredible accuracy, and Shu immediately realized that assassins had been sent after him. 2 people had innate strength, and clearly not of an ordinary level, but their aura was suppressed by something, revealing them to be professional killers. They weren't strong enough to forcefully break through the barrier, but everything indicated that they were at least from the courtyard. Then Shu decided to rely on his instincts. One man was at the peak of the Yuanting stage, and the other was at the Juwu level. Now the guy had to think about what to do next because he had nowhere to run. Meanwhile, the men began to force their way into the passage. But the door in front of them immediately swung open, and the killers jumped back. They clearly didn't expect such a surprise. However, the men decided to go in before their target ran away. Meanwhile, the house was in complete disarray. The killers thought that there had clearly been some kind of battle here. But this was not the case, and the hooded man frantically tried to understand what had happened here. He realized that there must be a place to live in the main manor, but the room was completely empty. Feng reacted faster and was already looking at the hero's back. Yu stood on a rock in the middle of the Goose Lake and looked into the distance, turning his back. The killers thought that this was not their target, but perhaps another participant in that battle. However, Shu dispelled their doubts by saying that they had finally found him. Therefore, the men immediately realized that they had found what they were looking for. Feng protested, saying that Shu Xiaoshuo's strength was 8th rank, while this one was already 9th. He didn't believe that it could be such a coincidence that today the guy broke through to the next level. The hooded man said that the guy was too similar to Shu, and besides, his strength had not reached the innate level. Feng didn't believe that everything could be so simple. They both hesitated and couldn't figure out what to do next. Meanwhile, Shu was still standing with his back to them, looking into the distant distances. It seemed as if he was not moving at all, and his figure stood stoically on the stone. But his face expressed something completely different, because now he was panicking. He had deliberately recreated the scene of the attack and was now trying to maneuver between the two roles, leaving the men confused. And judging by the surge in passive points, half the job was already done. But what remained was complete uncertainty. The guy decided to say out loud that they were too late in killing Shu. This was a deliberate provocation from the men, because in this way he almost said that he was their target. Having mentally conspired, the killers decided to attack. But Shu suddenly interrupted them, saying that they should not attack. Feng was taken aback by this reaction, because the figure in front of them didn't even turn around to understand that they were about to attack him. The professional killer hesitated again, and this began to make the hooded man quite nervous. Yu said in a serious voice that he was giving them a chance to escape. The trick worked, and now the second killer hesitated, not knowing what to do next. This was expected, because even the self-confident Kun was scared to the point of trembling at that moment and wanted to run. Xiao was also scared, and so they were getting closer and closer to the decision to get out of here. Without turning around again, Shu used the illuminated coals flame technique. An invisible flame began to dance around, creating mysterious and barely discernible spirals. Feng suddenly became frightened by such an amount of spiritual energy. Xiao also realized that it wasn't Shu, because no matter how much of a genius the guy was, it was impossible to break through 2 levels at once and obtain fire-type energy. Feng made the only right decision and mentally transmitted the order to his ally to escape. But Shu was already there, using his omnipresent sword technique, and barriers in the form of invisible flames began to appear before the men. Shu did this because if he stopped attacking, he would immediately give himself away. He did not attack them seriously, limiting himself to heating the air and increasing the pressure. Now he needed to check if the opponents had run away, so he used perception. Feng stopped in the meantime, and Shu began to realize that they suspected something. Plus, the notification bar was going crazy right now, quickly adding suspicion points. This greatly puzzled the guy because everything suddenly went wrong. And then Shu finally realized that Feng had deliberately stopped to scare him. Thus, the killer figured out that in front of him was the one they were looking for. Now they began to move on to the main part of their work. But Shu had no intention of breaking character, and so he simply declared loudly that this was his territory. With his spiritual aura, he outlined the area around him and the assassins fell into a trap. Feng hesitated again, because the real Shu would not have locked the wolves in his house. Xiao was about to move on to their plan, but he saw his partner getting nervous again. Feng was confused by his words, so he simply shut the man up. Panic was evident in his eyes, as he seriously thought they were trapped. Shu asked why Feng had turned around and was watching him, and the other's intuition began to scream even louder. Suddenly, Xiao noticed that the guy had simply disappeared. But later he noticed it in another place. Shu was already standing next to them, but turned only sideways, not with his back to them. Xiao saw bruises and cuts on him, realizing that this master had been fighting against their target. Suddenly, the ordinary rain began to develop into a thunderstorm, and purple lightning began to streak across the sky more and more often. Shu turned to face them, his face, illuminated by a nearby flash of lightning, distorted beyond recognition. Xiao realized that standing in front of him was the very guy they were looking for. However, Shu continued to look at them with an indifferent expression. And now they were no longer so confident in their arguments. Understanding their mood, the hero simply said that he was Shu Xiaoshuo. However, this time they didn't believe him. In any case, even if it was Zhu, the killers decided to flee because it was getting too scary here. The hero wanted to let them go, but his performance had to go on until the end, because Feng could cheat him again. He snapped his fingers, and suddenly a spark flew between them. And then the guy used the illuminated coals technique directly on Xiao. He didn't have any other discrete technique, so his new aspect was the only thing he could use. The man's clothes began to smoke, and he noted in surprise that this technique could even corrode protective spiritual energy. Feng, meanwhile, moved into a pocket subspace. Xiao decided to cover him while his partner retreated. Meanwhile, the hero just watched them wearily. Feng fled first because he only knew one escape technique, while his partner was much more skilled at it. Xiao had 7 different movement techniques, so if he alternated between them, no one would be able to catch up with him. They climbed out of that area, and Feng ran first. Meanwhile, the hooded man continued to burn. He simply could not understand what kind of witchcraft it was, because the fire did not go out. He also did not understand why his opponent did not attack, attributing it to the fact that, apparently, he was just an ant in the path of a more powerful adept. But that wasn't the case. Shu was mentally asking for help, because with his 9th rank, he didn't have a chance. Xiao's spiritual energy was starting to run out due to the invisible fire on his clothes, so he had to run right now. Shu asked him if he would leave. Suddenly, the hero realized that if he didn't stop Xiao now, his partner would be able to return and finish him off after the skirmish. Seeing the unfriendly look on the guy's face, the man decided to run away right then and there. Yu said with a serious expression that no one would leave here today. But Xiao didn't believe him, because the guy didn't even touch them and couldn't put a mark. However, Shu was counting on the man himself starting to come up with something. He started stalling for time by asking stupid questions. However, Xiao already realized that he had no chance of escaping, and therefore he decided on a deadly attack. Shu decided to play with him. The next moment, he noticed something transparent flying towards him. The hero immediately used the echo with sharpness, deflecting the projectile with his finger. But only after that did he realize that he had done something stupid, because he could have simply dodged. Xiao realized that his opponent had an innate body. There were no people with this skill in the courtyard, which only meant that the person standing before him was indeed Shu Xiaoshou. However, the guy immediately justified himself, calling it the technique of 10 pointing swords. And Xiao began to go crazy due to the realization that they were scared by a pitiful 9th rank ant. This meant that Shu no longer had to hide. He smiled and told the truth about who he was. However, Xiao immediately reacted to this by releasing all of his remaining aura. Shu's eyes lit up with mischief, and he said that the man would not be able to defeat him because he had run out of spiritual power. But Xiao believed in himself too much. The guy immediately jumped back from the man's blow. There was still a smile on his face because he was in a winning position. His opponent was at Yuanting peak, but he had no spiritual energy, meaning he had nothing to fight with. The fire was still burning on Xiao, so Shu decided to run around a bit to let the man use up all his strength. You could see from his face how difficult this was for him now, and Shu playfully ran away from him. Xiao was already on his last legs. Suddenly, the hero noticed that his opponent had decided to try to escape, and so he had to take action. However, Xiao switched back, preparing for battle. But Shu immediately started running away. Even for Xiao, this was already too toxic a fighting style. Suddenly, Shu began to slow down his pace, and then he stopped dead in his tracks. A sly grin appeared on his face, and he asked if the man had run out of energy. His opponent finally realized that Shu had been playing for time all this time. However, the man decided to start bluffing, asking if the guy really thought this would help him. But Shu replied that it couldn't be otherwise. However, Xiao had other thoughts, as he could still replenish his energy. He put his hand in his pocket and later stuck out his fist. On his palm was a pill that could correct his situation. That's why he immediately began to bring it to his mouth. But Shu only responded with a breathing technique, and the pill immediately began to disappear right in Xiao's hands. He simply couldn't believe his eyes. Zhu thanked him for the pill and asked if he had any other tricks. Now the killer's situation was truly hopeless. He had neither energy nor strength in his body. So he decided to switch to dialogue, asking if it was true that Shu was only rank 9. But he said that level was not his strong point, and then asked what rank Xiao was. He briefly replied that he was at the peak of the Yuanting stage. Shu called him a weakling and asked him his last words before he died. In response to this, Xiao only released his aura. This was quite unexpected, because Shu thought that the man had no strength left. The assassin made a sharp lunge, thrusting his blades forward. In response to this, Shu simply released the sword from his pocket space. He flew past like a bullet, forcing Xiao to defend himself, but the man then counterattacked. However, this attack was also unsuccessful, because Shu immediately released his fiery aura, forcing Xiao to jump back. He couldn't understand how this was even possible. Meanwhile, Shu decided to use the reverse sword style, and then his blade immediately cut off the man's head, spinning like a top in the air. Xiao's body fell backwards and his severed head rolled on. Shu grabbed one of the man's daggers, which managed to hit the target. He was in extreme pain. Yuanting Peak was truly terrifying, as Xiao was able to break through Shu's triple defense, which consisted of the innate body, the light of sharpness, and the protection of spiritual energy. Then, for some reason, the hero enveloped the man's body in his aura, and his severed head continued to watch Shu's actions in horror. He began to communicate with the corpse with a smile, saying that if Xiao had been a little smarter, he would not be on Earth. At the last moment, if Shu hadn't used the echo and was pierced in a vital point, the life cycle would not have worked. But the hero was not going to relax because he still had one more enemy. And he was right, because now a quick shadow flashed in the direction of his house in the forest. Feng managed to receive a message from Xiao via mental transmission, and he blamed himself for the man's death, because if he hadn't run away, Shu wouldn't have been able to kill him. He was going to avenge his partner at any cost. A little later, Feng had already reached home. He noticed Xiao's blade lying nearby, and I decided to jump straight towards him. Having examined the find more closely, he immediately recognized it as the blade of his deceased partner. And so he immediately stood up and began calling loudly for Shu. Feng couldn't figure out why the blade was located here or where its victim was now. But in response to his cries, he received only a dagger that flew at him like a bullet. Only at the last moment was he able to understand that he no longer had time to avoid it. But by using his aura, he was still able to block the blow. However, his energy was immediately scorched by an invisible fire. This meant that Shu was somewhere nearby, but hiding. And judging by the direction of the blade, he was either in the trees or behind Feng. Suddenly it dawned on the killer that Shu was at the bottom of the lake. And as proof of this, a shadow immediately flew out of the lake. Feng immediately applied the technique and cut the enemy with his palm. However, it was not Shu, but Xiao's head that he ripped open. And while Feng was in a state of righteous anger, the hero decided to show himself. He jumped out of the water and stood with one foot on the railing. And now an opponent appeared before Feng, who was already holding the hilt of his blade. The sword emanated an aura that was well known to the killer, and he immediately realized that this was the sword's innate intent. Shu had time to prepare for the assassin's arrival by swallowing 10 spirit-tempering pills and compressing his aura by a quarter. And so his normal strikes became as deadly as possible. And just one cut sent into the air immediately cut through nearby rocks and trees. Feng couldn't believe his eyes, because now his left hand had simply disappeared from this world. However, Shu was dissatisfied because the cut was crooked. So he immediately swung his sword again. And already the second limb separated from the killer's body. He simply couldn't bring himself to believe what he saw in front of him at that moment. And when the attack stopped, he already thought that Shu had run out of spiritual energy. So he immediately decided to run away. But the guy's next cut was aimed at his head. Before realizing what had happened, Feng only managed to see Xiao's sword that had flown towards him. Zhu smiled, but he felt hurt that he had miscalculated that the killer would be so weak. Feng managed to fall dead, and the hero decided to absorb his aura. And taking Wenchong into account, he already had 3 lives on his hands. And remembering the blonde, Shu thought that these two had probably come to take revenge for him. It was just never ending. So the guy decided to abstract himself from his problems and go to sleep. However, he suddenly received a notification that he had been awarded 1 point for being watched. This made the guy nervous. He immediately thought of Old Man San. It couldn't have been anyone else, because no one but him would have spied on the hero in such a perverted way. So Shu decided to play along, heading home unsuspectingly. But in fact, he used his perception. And then I saw some silhouettes sitting in the bush. Before he could come to his senses, this man was already behind Shu. The hero did not hesitate and immediately pulled his blade out of the ring. However, the man easily caught it with 2 fingers. In response to this, Shu protested and asked not to break his sword, otherwise he would cry. However, the man in the mask did not react in any way. Then he bent down and asked her to let go of his hand, saying that he just wanted to ask for directions. However, Shu found it strange that at such a time someone would ask strangers about the weather. And the hero's sword was getting closer and closer to the man's flesh. This had an effect, and the masked stranger began to panic. Noticing his emotions, Zhu still asked what he wanted. The notifications reported that the hero had become the object of obsessive thoughts, and therefore he thought that they would want to kill him later. That's why the sword immediately pierced the flesh. However, his opponent managed to dodge. The sword immediately flew to the side, and the man jumped to the side. But Shu didn't give him a chance, immediately hitting his head with his forehead. The masked man was taken aback by this attack, asking why the hero's head seemed to be made of metal. Then they started fighting, and Zhu was able to slip behind him to get into a choke. At that moment, he wondered what kind of technique the stranger possessed, since he was able to cut his palm with 2 fingers. His body was enhanced with 8 innate passive skills, but there was something wrong with this man. He thought that he was not from the Tianxian spiritual palace, but the stranger said that he was indeed from there. The hero received a notification that he had been awarded a point for uncovering the deception, so he immediately realized that the previous assassins were clearly from the palace. But this man did not come from here and was perhaps an absolute master. Then Shu asked him what he wanted, and the man only said that he wanted to know the way. He thought that the hero was just a small fry, and therefore he shouldn't show all his trump cards in front of him. Then the man spoke, asking how to get to the courtyard. Shu answered him calmly. After that, he was suddenly thrown back by the aura that suddenly appeared between them. The guy tried to ask him why he was going into the courtyard, but the stranger didn't answer him, saying only that the path of Shu's sword was wrong and he needed to turn away from it. The hero realized that the man really did see him kill. He turned to the stranger and said that his sword style was the idea of one genius which no man could understand. However, he replied that his path had long been trodden by others. Shu again began to say that this was a genius idea, but the man only laughed at him in his mind, which the hero realized after reading the notice. There was only silence between them, and the figure began to move away. Then Shu shouted something about 10 pointing swords, but the stranger ignored him. Shu thought he was mistaken, but the man's technique really was similar to what the guy saw in the scroll. The hero didn't bother filling his thoughts with nonsense and decided to go to sleep anyway. But suddenly he heard the sound of footsteps behind him, and it turned out to be the same stranger who was running towards him. And a whole crowd of guards was chasing him. Zhu realized that the masked man was playing a joke on him, because now his speed was much higher than he could have imagined. The stranger picked him up, asking him to play a role for him in exchange for his life. But the hero had little faith in him. During the escape, the man tested the boy's vital force. And then I realized that she was too powerful for what Shu had managed to show. By holding the boy hostage, he suppressed his recovery from the life cycle. And then blood started coming out of Shu's mouth. They were simply playing with him because the stranger's energy control was several levels higher. Su decided to try to scare the man by saying that Xiao Qi himself, the great elder from the Spiritual Techniques Pavilion, was standing behind him. Then the hero mentioned Old Man San, and the man asked in surprise if he had returned. Shu didn't immediately understand what he was asking. The stranger said that he was talking about Old Man San. Then the hero decided to say that he didn't know anything like that. Meanwhile, a full-scale search was being conducted in the forest. The guards came across the hero and the stranger, surrounding them in a semicircle. Shu couldn't figure out who this man was, since they had set up an entire ambush because of him. Xiao suddenly appeared in the forest and recognized the stranger as the same Sheng Nu that San had spoken of. Yu started screaming for help, saying that this man had killed 2 students. Xiao didn't like being treated like a fool, since he himself had seen the hero kill those 2. Shen Nu also didn't like that they were pinning on him something he didn't do. Shu asked to take on these 2 murders in exchange for being rescued from the palace. The hero realized that they were from that very just organization, and therefore said that he wanted to join them. And when asked about his name, he stated that his name was Wen Chong. At that moment, a full-scale explosion occurred under Sheng Nu's foot. This happened because of his energy, which he used to fly high up, and then it just hung in the air. Xiao didn't hesitate and immediately launched his blade at him. He confidently flew towards the enemy, not forgetting to quickly spin around his axis, and the old man controlled it with his hand. And a moment later, his sword was dangerously close to Sheng Nu. However, he only said that his grandfather was the weakest of those who dared to attack him. Zhu thought it was just a show-off. But suddenly something caught his eye. He realized that Xiao's sword had simply turned around, and then he rushed towards the old man. Flying like a bullet, it pierced the judge's chest, and from the mouth of the latter, a stream of blood immediately appeared. Shu never expected this outcome. The man asked the boy if he was following the path of the sword's intent. Shu decided to play the fool by saying that he was not that strong. Shen Yu only smiled in response, and blood started flowing from his mouth straight into his mask. Shu then asked if the man was using the omnipresent sword just now, and he said that this was the innate level of this skill. However, the hero already knew the answer to this question, since he himself possessed it. Then Sheng Nu began to talk about him, but Shu already knew everything. Their paths differed slightly, but the man immediately warned the boy that what the boy was studying was a dead end. Zhu thought he was talking nonsense. Apart from this, he had nothing because the guy had little talent for cultivation. While their high-flown dialogues continued, the guards were still standing at the guy's feet. They couldn't believe how strong their guest was, as he had defeated Xiao Qiqiu, the king of the Sword Dao throne, with one blow. Meanwhile, another man began to appear in the thicket. He was dressed in unusual clothes and his look was very serious. It was Ye Xiaotian, whom Shengnu immediately recognized. Zhu saw the legendary head of the inner courtyard for the first time. He approached Xiao and noticed that he was on his last legs. And a moment later, he simply disappeared. His figure appeared a meter away from Shengnu. He immediately took action. The man explained that Ye Xiaotian's technique could tear apart the fabric of space, destroying everything that came into reach. There was no point in running from him, as his attribute was extremely rare and just as unfairly strong. But Ye Xiaotian only said that he was no match for Shengnu, who was capable of cutting down masters. However, the man only made excuses. Shu, meanwhile, was dumbfounded, because when he killed a Yuanting-level cultivator, he thought that he could be considered a monster. But real monsters were now beside him. Then the hero decided to immediately inform the director that he was not on the same side as Shengnu. Therefore, he asked to be released to the ground so that he could leave here himself. The director was surprised by the guy's resilience, who joked under pressure from two monsters. But he had no plans to stop. And then space began to distort. Shengnu warned him that if Ye Xiaotian entered the battle, the people in the ambush would not survive, just like Shu. At that moment, golden flashes flared nearby and shot into the sky. These were the elders and the strongest people in the palace, whom Shengnu held back only by the force of his intent. Shu was surprised by his skills, but he didn't understand why the man was bothering with him and trying to dissuade him from going further along the path of the sword. The 9 great elders were tied up, unable to do anything. Ordinary soldiers couldn't believe that people of the master level could be so easily restrained by will alone. Ye Xiaotian also couldn't move, and Shu was increasingly confused about what was going on here. The director, meanwhile, was indignant, because these elders should not have entered into battle at all. Suddenly he was able to move, immediately attacking Shengnu. Shu tried not to panic. Meanwhile, the elders tried to tell Ye Xiaotian that he shouldn't look back at them in order to capture the enemy of humanity. However, the man only glanced suspiciously at the old man, asking why he had such a nickname. Silence was his answer, but Shengnu had already managed to launch his attack at the old man. Purple lines immediately passed through the body of one of the elders, and the skirmish between Ye Xiaotian and Shengnu was immediately interrupted. In the midst of the battle, an invisible but extremely burning fire appeared. The eyes of the ordinary fighters bulged out of their heads. They saw Elder San standing in the air not far from the two fighters. Shu was surprised by such a spectacular appearance. Ye Xiaotian realized that San had been waiting all this time until they were completely pressed. The old man immediately told Shengnu that he could do whatever he wanted with everyone, but he had to let Shu go. Meanwhile, the rest of the elders were still bound hand and foot, and the hero was extremely happy that the old man came to save him. Shengnu realized that Shu was truly worth something since Sun recognized him, and the old man decided to calm him down, saying that as long as the hero had breath, he would be able to bring him back to life. It didn't sound very promising. San began to release his aura, moving into action. He immediately rushed towards Shengnu, not allowing him to escape. And then the man's aura was enveloped in an invisible flame. It spread to Shu, which he immediately noticed. And then blood started coming out of his mouth again. He felt the real heavenly flame of illuminated coals on himself, which was much more terrifying than what he had used before. Shengnu immediately retreated, agreeing to hand over Shu. San managed to catch him with his aura, and the man tried to get away from them. Finally, the old man caught the young man, and then he just pinched his cheek. To his surprise, the hero immediately came to his senses, and San didn't expect anything else. He was glad to see the guy waking up. But Shu was not thinking about the fact that he had been safely rescued, but about the fact that he had almost been burned along with the enemy. Shengnu, meanwhile, tried to defend himself from the fire, and his technique was weakened by its impact. Then the elders were able to free themselves from their bonds. Just like Ye Xiaotian, who was already using his spatial technique to the fullest, deathly black bundles of energy immediately rushed towards the man. San tried to stop him, but it was too late. Shu didn't understand why the old man was doing this, but Shengnu was already in a hurry to confirm the elder's fears. A beam of bright blue energy immediately pierced Ye Xiaotian's abdomen. However, he immediately disappeared, And finding himself on the other side, he continued to use his technique. Finally, the black cords caught up with Shengnu. Shu couldn't predict whether the man would survive. But suddenly something didn't go according to plan. Shengnu suddenly appeared right above the director's head, and his fingers immediately pierced the old man's larynx. This allowed Shengnu to take the director hostage. He forced the elders to stop, because if any of them moved, the man would finish what he started. Out of powerlessness, the entire top of the palace began to get angry. In response to this, Shengnu cut off Ye Xiaotian's arm with his hand. He said that talking also counts as movement. Shu was increasingly surprised at how strong Shengnu was, that he could easily stand up to such a large group of masters on his own. San hit him on the head, saying that the guy was thinking about the wrong thing. If you take Shengnu as an example, you will quickly die. However, admiring sighs could still be heard from Shu. San just shook his head, realizing that he wouldn't be able to convince his student. He then turned to Shengnu, saying that he thought that he would not come today. The man began to demand something from San, but he only said that if Shengnu turned around right now, no one would stop him from leaving. However, the man had his own plan, so he began to blackmail San. But the old man said that as long as he lived, not a single sword or blade of grass from the Tianxin spiritual palace would leave the vault. Zhu began to wonder what kind of sword this was, but Shengnu decided to hurry him up, hinting at Ye Xiaotian's life. Old man San began to get angry because of such threats. Then Shengnu asked Shu to give him what he needed. The hero was genuinely tired of other people's attention, and again did not understand why everyone was so fixated on him. San's anger began to transcend all conceivable and inconceivable limits. Then Shengnu realized that nothing would work out for him today. He let go of Ye Xiaotian and created a rift in space. After using the escape technique, he finally addressed Shu, calling him Wen Ming, and said that he would come for him. The hero cheerfully shouted that this was his name, so let the man look for him. But before closing the crack, Shengnu said that even if the name was not real, he had seen Shu's face. This did not add to the hero's confidence. Meanwhile, the rain had stopped, and somewhere beyond the horizon, the sun began to appear. The elders didn't look very good, because today they only lost to one enemy. They had to come to terms with it, and a moment later they were all gone. Meanwhile, Old Man San and Ye Xiaotian were met by ordinary soldiers. They addressed them as the director and the deputy director. Shu only now realized that Old Man San was the vice director. Rumor has it that the spiritual palace has a deputy who has been away from court for many years. When the palace was first being built, Deputy Sun created a cloud peak and burned it halfway down, creating a platform capable of accommodating thousands of people. Shu only now realized how much the legendary figure had protected him. The old man's character was such that no one would say that he stood at the top. After the general meeting, San ordered everyone to disperse, and then the three of them went to the palace, and Zhu tried to escape from them. But San didn't let him escape. Now he came to the attention of the entire top brass of the palace. But Shu did not give up trying to escape from this predicament, saying that he needed to build a house. The old people were deeply surprised that the boy, after such experiences, thought only about his home. Xiao asked with displeasure whether it was true that Shu had killed a man. Killing a disciple in the outer courtyard would lead to the scaffold of the spiritual techniques pavilion, and therefore the matter was serious. So Shu, as if in secret, said that those students were killed by that guy in the mask. But Xiao sat in ambush all night and saw everything with his own eyes. Shu explained that those two had come for his head themselves, so the old man could have intervened. Xiao didn't understand why the hero killed people but acted like a victim. But he explained with a serious face that it was self-defense. Then Xiao asked San what he should do about it, and the old man playfully slapped him on the back of the head and praised him. Shu was simply taken aback by such a reaction. Just like the director and Xiao, Ye Xiaotian couldn't believe that right in front of him, Sun was encouraging his disciple to kill. San explained that he had prepared this plan several days ago, and Shu had done everything correctly because no one would have helped him. So he was glad that the hero was able to turn the murder against them. Today's takeover plan failed, and the masked man killed 2 students, which is exactly how San wanted things to go. Xiao immediately glanced sideways at Ye Xiaotian, asking him with his eyes if everything was okay here. Then San glanced sideways at him, and then he told him that if he wanted to restore his hand, he should just nod. He fell for such easy blackmail and agreed. Zhu realized that the real director of the palace was not Ye Xiaotian at all. The latter remembered the hero, asking if he was this year's champion, and upon receiving confirmation, he declared that the guy could be transferred to the inner courtyard. Yu simply couldn't find what to say in response to this news, and San immediately slapped the director on the head. Then the man looked at the old man like a naughty kitten. San angrily ordered him to return to the elders and announced that Shu was of no use to anyone in the courtyard. At this moment, the hero became doubly sad. Now San ordered them to disperse too. Only he and Shu remained, who continued to stand in place. He was about to ask to leave, but the old man had completely different plans for him. The grandfather stopped the young man, saying that he couldn't leave yet because he wanted to tell him a story. There were 5 regions on the Holy Continent at the present time. In the distant central region of the Holy Heaven, there is a sacred palace, a holy place for all the spiritual masters on the continent. Shu was in the eastern region of the Sword Sky, where most people practice swordsmanship, and he didn't know much about the other regions. Then San said that inside the palace there was a lake similar to their Goose Lake, but twice as big. Its name was the Big Goose Lake. On its banks there is often a young man, about the same age as Shu, who loves to train his body. He achieved the innate body, but the joy was short-lived, because one night an old bald monk appeared and forced him to take the fiery seed. Zhu thought that the young man who had been fed this seed was now taking revenge on the hero. San continued, saying that a month later the boy's body was destroyed by fire, and the old bald monk appeared again, passing on the technique of the heavenly flame of illuminated coals. The young man had no choice but to study this method with hatred, returning to his innate level within a year and reaching the level of a master within 3 days. Shu then asked if the monk had thought that some people might not like this approach, but San was irritated because they were clearly hinting at him. The old monk said that ordinary people live in the vanity of the world, but only those who strive for progress will appear in the sacred palace. Without the desire for revenge, the young man would hardly have survived the process of his body being destroyed and then being reborn as a master. Zhu then asked why San chose him. The old man said that he didn't really expect any results, since deaths from these seeds reach hundreds. Returning to the story, the young man also asked this, and the monk then added a few more words. This world is just a prison, where everyone seeks freedom. A person is born small and invisible. No one sees his light. But when you reach a certain level, your light is noticed, but you still remain a pawn. And then you create the same pawns around you, founding a castle inside the prison, thinking that this is freedom. So the question remained as to how Shu would try to escape from this prison. Then the hero demonstrated his strength, and then he said that this is liberation. However, San only said that even after being freed, he would only see one more layer of the sky. The hero did not understand him. Therefore, the old man explained that until Shu reached absolute power, he needed to play the role of a pawn so as not to be noticed. In response, the hero promised San that he would destroy all the prisons. The old man said that he had once said the same thing, and Shu finally realized that the story was connected with San's life. And when the young man called that monk a disgusting pervert, the grandfather hit him on the head. Shu didn't quite understand why he was hit. After this, San looked at him meaningfully and asked if he wanted to become his student. The hero responded by asking if he would be kind to him. This made San angry. Then Shu understood his mood, and now he bowed his forehead to the floor, begging him to take him as a disciple. He realized that if it weren't for San, the boy could have died today. Besides, the old man had been looking after him for a long time, and such sincerity brought tears to San's eyes. Then he helped the guy get up. A little later, the action moved to the courtyard. In one of the spiritual places, someone's mug broke again. Jiang was furious. He asked the girl to send a couple of people after Shu, and she ordered them to kill him. But even so, she did not succeed. However, she denied everything. She was more concerned about the wine jug, which had been standing for less than a day and was already lying broken on the floor. Now the bald man was interested in what the girl would do. She said with a sly smile that if you can't kill, then you need to keep killing. This was Father Zhang's order, which the girl was going to carry out even if he didn't want it. The bald man just grabbed his head, because if the executive pavilion got wind of this, their heads would roll off their shoulders. He said that if the girl did this again, the door from the pavilion would no longer open for her. She tried to justify herself somehow, but he rudely said that if she rebelled, he would eliminate her. Suddenly, the door to their house opened unexpextedly. The same boy with the sword came to them, who told the bald man that he would eliminate him too if he dared to raise his hand. Zhang recognized the guy as He Yuxin and asked if he was the one who called Feng Kun out of order. He was silent for a while. And then the bald man said that Yusin shouldn't have listened to that girl. His finger was pointed at the girl's face, and the guy suddenly said that if Zhang didn't remove it, he could say goodbye to his hand. The bald man's foot suddenly broke through the floor. He immediately stood up, tired of listening to these threats, and Yuxing immediately struck the floor with his sword. Their forces clashed, and a nearby wall was breached. A figure appeared from there, and the middle-aged man who came to visit them said that Zhang Shao, Yuqing, and Lan Xiangzi should go to the Pavilion of Spiritual Techniques. People were surprised by the speed of the performer's work. Then the bald man asked Zhao Xidong what he meant. The man explained that he already knew everything, since this was not the first time he would be going to court. However, the bald man still didn't show it. The man immediately remembered Shu and his bad temper. Therefore, he immediately said that it concerned him, and it was Senior Xiao's personal order. No one wanted to argue with Elder Xiao. Their silence dragged on, and so Sidon asked if they would go to court or if he needed to intervene. Yuxing approached him and said that until he had evidence, they would not move forward. Otherwise, he would have to look for Feng and Shao. The man was surprised that they didn't know anything and said that 2 guys had died. This left the swordsman confused. Now Sidun decided to intervene, and Yuxin decided that he would go to court after all. He asked Zhang to be here because he could figure it out himself. Then the couple let the swordsman go alone. Sidun found the situation very interesting, but out loud he only rudely ordered Yusin to follow him. However, they didn't get far, because someone's monstrous aura fell upon them. A wide furrow immediately appeared on the floor nearby, and someone's voice ordered Zhang Xingxun to go out. It was surprising that someone had the courage to act forcefully in front of the performer of the Spiritual Techniques Pavilion, so people came out to see who it was. The rift was truly enormous. Meanwhile, Zhao Yinyan was standing on the street. The bald man immediately recognized her and smiled. Lan Xiangzi felt a little sad as Zhang spoke very softly to the redhead, and she suddenly shook her head, and Su appeared behind her. The bald man couldn't understand what she was doing, and the girl was righteously angry because of Shu. Sidun suggested that she at least wait until he left, since doing such a thing in daylight was truly too much. But in response to this, Su asked him to close the back entrance and not let him escape. The man immediately said out loud that this was nonsense, but the girl explained that the Elder Xiao had ordered Zhang to be killed without mercy. She showed the token, but people immediately realized that she had simply stolen it. Zhou was also nearby and asked what had happened. Even ordinary soldiers already knew about the events of the previous night. They explained to Zhou that the entire top brass of the palace had set up an ambush and failed. The guy then assumed that Zhang Xingxun was the guy in the mask. But that sounded like nonsense, and then they started discussing Feng. It was Zhang who sent him to kill, as all the elders saw. Then Zhou thought it was revenge, but one of the guys explained that they themselves had been killed. The swordsman couldn't believe that some disciple from the outer courtyard had killed 2 assassins from the inner courtyard. However, his friend explained that Su had named the guy, and his name was Xiao Shu. The others immediately recognized Shu, and Zhou found out he was his friend after all. The guys started discussing it among themselves, and Zhou was very surprised at how quickly Shu was progressing.